Well, good afternoon. I am Assemblyman Wes Chesbrough, and this is the very first hearing of the newly created Assembly Committee on Disabilities. I'm very proud and pleased to announce. And I'm very, very pleased that you're here. Besides the long history that, of course, individuals with disabilities and families have with the disabilities, the issues surrounding disabilities, the legislature has a long history going back to Frank Lanterman and I'm sure before of focusing on these issues. I think as many of you knew, throughout my 8 years in the State Senate, I chaired the Senate Select Committee on Developmental Disabilities and Mental Health, and was quite disappointed upon my departure that nobody picked it up and it didn't continue. So I'm very pleased to tell you that the Speaker of the Assembly, Karen Bass, agreed when I asked her to create a select committee on disabilities, and we didn't define categories this time. We just created a broad umbrella because we know there's many different things that come under the rubric of disabilities. But I think it's very important that we continue and build the institutional knowledge, especially in a time of term limits and high staff turnover. That we try to make sure this building has the capacity to shine a bright light on the issues that individuals face, families face, caregivers and providers of services face when dealing with trying to live an independent, dignified life in the community, and that's what we're all about. So I'm very pleased to be kicking off these efforts. We're going to be talking later in the year. I'm not sure what the time frame is, but we're going to be having also in the near future a mental health hearing. So we're also going to be very much returning to monitoring that subject. I also think that this is a time, with all of the budget cuts and challenges of the economy that everybody's facing, to do oversight and to make sure that there's opportunities not just under the pressure of budget hearings, which budget subcommittees feel, but also you know, in the hopefully the calmer schedule where we can really have a conversation and really listen to each other, and this select committee provides the opportunity for that. I'd like to introduce Rob Lane, who is the consultant to the committee and who worked very hard to put this hearing together, did a white paper, and did the organizing for this. And I'll mention in a minute all the different materials that are available at my website that he has that he's prepared, that I hope can help to build the institutional knowledge of the people in this building to make it more strongly connected to the people who need us to be attentive to their issues. So thanks for coming, and I'd like to particularly thank Paul Longmore, Catherine Blakemore, Joe Medors, and Terry Delgadillo for being available to participate in this hearing. I think you all know this year has been a great challenge, particularly for consumers, family members, and service providers trying to grapple with not only the bad economy, but also the impact that that economy has had, creating over $300 million in cuts to important services to the regional centers and to IHSS. At the same time, we see that state facilities like Sierra Vista have closed their doors. The Lanterman Developmental Center has now been announced that they're going to begin the deinstitutionalization process. And, you know, while many will celebrate that, there's also real issues around trying to make sure that that when that's happening during a time of budget cuts, that we're not creating the same kinds of problems that the state created for mental health clients when the institutional settings began to close and the services were not made available in the community. So I think we have a duty to address those questions. In order to be successful, to help restore the many cuts in the future and defend our current programs, we absolutely must join together and send a unified message to the governor and to members of this legislature, especially those who are new and do not historically know or understand this community. I think that's the educational process in an era of term limits is absolutely critical. We need to think long-term, focus on the deinstitutionalization process, and continue discussing how we are supporting consumers through the regional centers in living in the community. We need to build a working coalition of legislative members and staff who understand this issue. And this brings us to the focus of today's hearing. My previous Senate Select Committee allowed for important policy debates and shed light on important issues, and this was possible because There was a knowledge and a deep understanding of the groundbreaking nature of the Olmstead ruling, the value of the Lanterman Act, and the understanding of the delicate balance of the developmental center, regional center dynamic. I can't just pick up where I left off in the Senate. We members of the committee and everyone sitting in the audience have a lot of work to do. We must begin today by bridging the gap of knowledge, by educating new members about the changing face of people with disabilities, explaining the importance of Olmstead and the Lanterman Act, talking about the entitlement issues that have existed with Lanterman that are now under threat, but also what an amazing difference in the lives of disabled persons both Lanterman and Olmstead have made, and how we need to continue to build on that. My goal as chair of this committee is to break the barriers, shatter the stereotypes, build a deep understanding of this very important issue, not just in a few offices in this building, but in every office in the Capitol. Showing how each consumer who is affected by budget cuts is touched not once, but many times by proxy cutting, which I guess it's come to be known, meaning the cumulative effect of multiple cuts, whether it's IHSS, Medi-Cal, or the regional center system. We are talking about a valuable community of people who have so much to offer, and yet whose lives and independence have so much been undermined by the actions of recent years. In the spirit of education, my staff has developed a basic but informative white paper on the topic of developmental disabilities. It is intended to be used as an introduction to the subject and an educational tool. It's included in today's materials, but also is available online at the committee website, along with our mission and vision statement, hearing forms, the agenda for this and future hearings, hearing requests, and other important items. So let's begin the hearing. It's officially entitled Celebrating Our Past While Forging Ahead, but that is really just a fancy way of saying let's roll up our sleeves and get to work. And with that, I'd like to ask my colleague, Tom Amiano, who's chairing another very important select committee on employment of persons with disabilities, if he wants to say a few words before we go into our first panel.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chair Chesborough. And interestingly enough, this morning I did attend my second commission meeting on disabled access, and that commission is getting off its feet, so to speak, with a very, very limited budget of only $80,000. And so we're working with Senator Corbett about trying to change that situation. In the meantime, of course, I'd like to thank the chair of the Select Committee for championing this issue. It's been my pleasure to work cooperatively with Assemblymember Chesborough on this issue, and I chair a related Select Committee, the Select Committee on Workforce Development within the developmentally disabled community. At our first hearing of that Select Committee last November, we received testimony on the greater need for training as services become more individualized and provided in home and community settings instead of in centralized settings where the work is more routine and where supervision is present. We also received testimony that California needs to look at workforce issues across the system and not necessarily provider by provider. For example, it was made clear in our first hearing that we need to address cultural competency in the workforce to address the needs of specific groups, such as the immigrant and ethnic communities who have very diverse needs only understood by that group. We need to stabilize the direct support workforce through innovations such as improved training, improved funding, tied to improvements in training and consumer outcomes, and developing sector intermediaries that the workers and agencies together can promote training, retention, and career development. While the focus in our first hearing was to learn how to strengthen the provider side of the workforce with the developmentally disabled community, our second hearing will focus on California's efforts to support people with developmental disabilities in getting real living wage jobs. The hearing will address the level of state support of supported employment and strategies for better funding for agencies to provide that service. We are in the planning stages of that hearing, but we anticipate getting information out later this month with a planned hearing date for sometime in early March, and we look very much forward to learning more at that hearing and welcome participation as we develop the agenda. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Amiano. Other members of the committee are in other committee meetings. We're hopeful they'll be coming in and out as we proceed today. I know many of them have their staffs present in the audience, and so they're participating indirectly, even if they're not at the dais this afternoon. The first panel has been designed to give an overview and a history. Since this is a new select committee, it seemed like it was important that we not just sort of jump into the quagmire of the present. We are joined by Professor Paul Longmore of the Institute of Disability at San Francisco State University, Catherine Blakemore, the Executive Director of Disability Rights California, and Joe Medors, I hope I pronounced your name right, Joe, who is the Executive Director of People First of California. They all have long and exemplary resumes, but rather than sit here and read the resumes, I'm going to let them talk, because I think as they speak, we will see what they have to bring to the table and contribute to the discussion. So let's begin with Professor Longmore.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to acknowledge the assistancy of Mr. Lee, who's here to accompany me.
Glad to have you here, and thanks for your help.
Okay. The history of people with disabilities in California has involved two conflicting societal perspectives and two contradictory sets of public policies. The one was exclusionary and segregationist, the other democratic and integrationist. The former has viewed people with disabilities as not just inferior, but in many ways dangerous to society. The latter has affirmed their claims to civil rights and self-determination. In both, California has reflected and often set national patterns. In the late 19th century, many U.S. cities passed what were called unsightly beggar ordinances that excluded people with visible disabilities from appearing in public places. The first such law that we know of was adopted by the city of San Francisco on July 9, 1867. It declared in part, quote, "Any person who is diseased, maimed, mutilated, or in any way deformed so as to be an unsightly or disgusting object, or an improper person to be allowed in or on the streets, highways, thoroughfares, or public places in the city or county of San Francisco shall not therein or thereon expose himself or herself to public view." Anyone convicted of violating this ordinance was to be fined up to $25 or imprisoned in the county jail for up to 25 days, or both. Section 4 of the ordinance provided an alternative to the fine and imprisonment. The convicted person with the disability might be, quote, "committed to the almshouse." In the next several decades, cities across the United States adopted statutes that borrowed the language of the San Francisco Ordinance to bar people with visible disabilities from public places. Many permitted magistrates to waive the fine and jail time if they committed the violator to an almshouse or poor farm or hospital. These laws aimed at more than regulating disabled beggars or looking after destitute people with disabilities. They undertook to cleanse public space of people deemed, quote, unsightly or disgusting, close quote, or as Chicago's aldermen in their version of the ordinance described them, quote, unsightly and unseemly. Unseemliness entailed an accusation of indecency. Disgust expressed both moral revulsion and social contempt. The attribution of unsightliness declared that some things, some people must be kept hidden. This regulatory campaign, backed by progressives and conservatives alike, enforced the bias that anyone with a visible disability threatened disorder in the community. The provisions authorizing incarceration in an almshouse, poor farm, or hospital helped pave the way for locking up in large-scale institutions many people with what we now call developmental disabilities, people who were labeled in that era as feeble-minded. Feeble-minded people were blamed for the increases in poverty, vice, and crime that accompanied industrialization and urbanization. Professional experts warned the public in virtually hysterical terms of what they called the menace of the feeble-minded. They asserted that feeble-minded men were likely to become paupers and beggars, criminals and sexual predators, while feeble-minded women would surely become prostitutes. Society must protect itself by confining them all in what became massive, bleak, and brutalizing institutions. But there were just too many people with developmental and other disabilities to lock them all up. So other segregationist measures, such as those unsightly beggar ordinances, tried to prevent them from contaminating the community. Early in the 20th century, one of the main arguments for special classes was not that children with disabilities had an equal right to an education, but that their presence in regular classrooms hindered the education and development of non-disabled children. This argument is still heard today against mainstreaming and inclusion of children with disabilities in schools. But some children with disabilities in that earlier time, at least for a time, did attend regular classes. A 1918 court case in Wisconsin evidenced, though, that there was resistance to their presence. In Wisconsin, a public school expelled an 11-year-old boy with cerebral palsy, not because he was unable to keep up academically, but because, according to the court record, his teacher and fellow students found him, quote, depressing and nauseating. The Wisconsin State Supreme Court upheld his expulsion. It would not be until 1975 that children with disabilities in the United States of America gained the right to go to a public school along with their non-disabled peers. That's nice. Adults with disabilities historically met with job discrimination in both the private and public sectors. In the early 20th century, adults with disabilities who sought work protested exclusionary federal civil service hiring practices, as well as New Deal work relief policies that rejected job applicants with disabilities as, quote, unemployable, close quote. But then came the labor shortages of World War II, and adults with disabilities who had previously been turned away as unfit for work suddenly became, as one expert put it, a vast reservoir of potential workers. People with every sort of disability, including people with developmental and mental disabilities, went to work, many of them in the work plants in California. But when the war ended and millions of non-disabled white men returned, workers with disabilities, like women and people of color, lost their jobs. In the post-war era, some disability rights activists called for legal protections against employment discrimination. Their proposals met with stiff resistance. Finally, in the 1970s, a new generation of disability rights activists charged that the attitude campaigns that were intended to persuade employers to hire the handicapped actually didn't reduce prejudice at all, nor did they bring down the extraordinarily high unemployment rates among working-age adults with every sort of disability. Research since that time has consistently confirmed that widespread bias still exists among private sector employers and public sector agencies. discrimination and prejudice against job applicants with virtually any kind of disability. Also, discrimination in wages and discrimination in access to health insurance. Meanwhile, millions of working-age adults are kept out of the job market by social welfare policies that will provide health insurance, personal assistance services, and payment for assistive devices as long as those disabled persons stay unemployed and impoverished and dependent on the state. But those same policies penalize them by taking away those vital benefits if they take any job that pays even meager wages. Back in the early 20th century, eugenicists lobbied for state laws to compel the sterilization of people with many kinds of disabilities. More than half the states adopted sterilization statutes. Every one of those laws targeted people with developmental disabilities. And the state of California led the way in the sterilization campaign. But those who feared that the social contamination of people with developmental and other disabilities believed that segregation and sterilization were still insufficient to protect society. So they advocated euthanasia. One of the most powerful arguments for euthanasia of people with developmental disabilities appeared in a best-selling novel that is now considered a literary classic of Mice and Men. In this story, by the celebrated California author John Steinbeck, the intellectually disabled Lenny is not only unable to control his capacity for violence, he also burdens his pal George and destroys the dream of a farm that will rescue George and several other down-and-out farm workers from the ravages of the Great Depression. Hence, George's mercy killing of Lenny eliminates an individual who is portrayed as not only a personal burden, but a societal and economic burden. When reread as a pro-euthanasia tract of Mice and Men is chilling, especially as it continues to influence the unconscious attitudes of so many current-day students and other readers, and particularly as one encounters similar arguments in the contemporary pro-euthanasia movement. Well, throughout this long history, and especially in the decades since World War II, people with disabilities of all kinds and non-disabled advocates of their rights have resisted all of this oppression. They have fought for educational rights. During the 1950s and 1960s, parents launched a movement for their children's right to an equal and integrated mainstream public education. In the early 1970s, estimates reckoned that there were 7 million school-age children with disabilities in the U.S., but that 1 million of them were completely excluded from public schools, and another 3 million were in school but not receiving an appropriate education. In 1975, the movement won passage of one of the most far-reaching pieces of educational legislation in U.S. history, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. Meanwhile, adults with disabilities demanded access to higher education. To take just one California example, in 1962, Edward Roberts, a high school honor student and quadriplegic, sought admission to UC Berkeley. A university official told him, "We've tried cripples before and it didn't work." Refusing to back down, Roberts not only graduated from UC, he became the father of the independent living movement and ultimately the director of the California Department of Rehabilitation. California advocates also fought for the right of people with disabilities to live in the community. Opponents of institutions that warehouse people with developmental disabilities condemned them as, quote, retarding environments. Said one, if we stick them in institutions, the institutions retard them so that they are unable to function in society, and then we say they're retarded. They can't function in society. People with physical disabilities also launched their own independent living movement. Activists in both of these campaigns lobbied for programs such as the regional center system and in-home support services. Few states matched California's commitment to community integration through those programs. These efforts were part of the larger disability rights movement. That movement has not been a homogeneous or unitary effort, but an assemblage of campaigns that arose among blind people, deaf people, psychiatric survivors, people with learning disabilities, people with physical disabilities, and people with developmental disabilities. Each has addressed issues and pursued agendas particular to their constituencies, but they've all operated from increasingly similar principles. Let me just note key elements of the agendas of the developmental disabilities and independent living movements. Both have campaigned for the right of people with disabilities to live in the community. They've also then demanded legal protection from discrimination, the right to receive quality treatment or services, the right to refuse treatment or services, due process in all professional or governmental decision-making affecting them, equal access to public transportation and public accommodations, and most fundamental, opposition to forced institutionalization and correspondingly the right to services to support living in the community. Those services include aid with personal maintenance and hygiene, mobility, household chores, such as cooking, cleaning, and childcare, cognitive tasks such as money management, and communication access such as interpreting and reading. Two important principles underlie these objectives. First, the demand for self-determination. This involves not only individual choices in daily living, but also a collective political voice on the part of disability communities in the formulation of public policies and programs that affect people with disabilities. Both forms of self-determination have been expressed in the political demand, nothing about us without us. The second principle is the claim that people with disabilities have a right for the means, a right to the means necessary to enable them to participate in the community. This principle redefines services and assistive devices, accessibility, and reasonable accommodations as not ways of caring for those who are fundamentally dependent, but alternative modes of functioning and the necessary means for social participation and social integration. Disability rights advocates have campaigned for establishment of these means to social integration as enforceable rights rather than dispensations of public or private charity. Advocates have sometimes argued that funding community-based living and in-home support services is less expensive than institutionalization or nursing home placement. But more important than that pragmatic argument, they have asserted not only the right of people with disabilities to live in the world, but also their right to the means to make that right effective. We stand at yet another turning point in the history of people with disabilities. It is a pivotal moment in which Californians must decide which of these two perspectives that I've outlined regarding people with disabilities, which of these two perspectives the community will adhere to, which of these two sets of public policies the state will follow. Thank you.
Well, thank you very, very much, both for your words here, but also all of your work that you're writing about history in general, but most specifically about the history of persons with disabilities, and it really helps to create the context for our discussion. I was particularly struck with your use of the word retarding as a verb caused by the setting as opposed to a condition caused by a disability. That really cut through an awful lot and touched me. So one thing that occurs to me, I mean, the context you've created is really that the importance of disability rights as a mainstream part of the human rights, the movement for human rights for all people. And yet I think it lags behind a little bit in terms of the visibility and the public understanding of that, perhaps than some of the other more visible civil rights movements that we have had in our country and in the world. And your work certainly strives against that and moves disability rights right into the mainstream. What do you think we as a state or we as a culture can do to further that, to help to bring the mainstreaming of the understanding of the humanness and the importance of human rights to persons with disabilities?
Well, I think hearings like this, and more important, the establishment of your committee is one key way. And I know that you and Mr. Alviano are committed to other rights causes, insofar as in your public roles you can show the linkage, the parallels, the commonalities, the connections, even the overlaps among various rights movements to enable the public and the media especially to come to understand that this is another rights movement, another human rights cause, different in some ways but similar in many ways to already recognized movements for human rights and human dignity. I think that will provide a great impetus in the direction that you're wanting to see.
Well, thank you very much again for your comments here today and all of your work. So I'd like to introduce Assemblyman Bell, our colleague who has been an outspoken advocate for the rights of persons with disabilities. We're very pleased to have him as a member of the committee. And I know with the very few exceptions, just about any bill that Jim Bell is authoring, I want to be a co-author of, because he's usually at the out front leading the charge. So, any questions from member? What's that? I said, well, I had to make an exception, not everything, but certainly with regards to all the topics that are before us today. So, any questions for Mr. Longmore?
No, just a generalized comment. Thank you so much, and you've always been so eloquent. And we were very lucky in the Bay Area to have people like you. There was a real activist movement in the Bay Area, and a lot of it was the stereotyping. And so, we would have people in the early 70s chain themselves in their wheelchairs to, I think it was AC Transit at the time, because transportation, of course, and mobility is a big issue. If you can't get from one place to another, then you are effectively disempowered. I have a background in special education. I taught at the San Francisco Unified for over 20 years, once at Louise Lombard School, which was adjacent at that time to the university, and there was a large rally at Civic Center. You could probably, it was at 5:04. There was a law that would have gone a long way in helping with human rights and civil rights. And so the parents of the children in my school said, please bring the kids to the rally. And I'll try to make this short. So when the kids came to my school, that we fed them breakfast. But we couldn't feed them breakfast that day because we wanted to get there for the rally. And it was very exciting. It was very electric. And I think there was a Secretary of Health, was it Califano? Secretary of Health, people with disabilities, grabbed him on the arm and, tried to interfere with his access to the building. It was extremely dramatic. And one of the chants was, what do you want? Rights. When do you want it? Now. And of course, we hadn't fed the kids. So one of the picket captains went, what do you want? And the kid next to me went, French toast. But there's a metaphor there. Yeah, I just want to eat like and not being treated.
Like
it
everybody else.
wasn't very empowering. But anyway, thank you so much, because I was very fortunate to, be exposed to that and get involved with that. And I know that the late Harvey Milk, always in his litany of those disempowered and disenfranchised, he would use the term handicap, and that was the term. Anyway, it's been a great learning experience for me, and there's so much more to do. And we know the Bush administration was trying to water down the ADA, and every time we move forward, there's something that puts us backwards. I even picketed, and I hope I can say this, the Jerry Lewis telethon, because there were disabled activists who took exception to the portrayal.
Well, I was really struck in another thing that really struck me in your presentation was the first of those really horrific ordinances in our country being in San Francisco, and then the Bay Area turning out to be the place where disability rights really was, in many ways, I've not born at least the major center of advocacy. So that struck me as well. So, well, thank you again for a great presentation and helping to set the context for the committee's work and for today's discussion. So,
thank you for inviting me.
Next we have, I think, someone who's probably familiar to most of us, Catherine Blakemore, who's the Executive Director of Disability Rights California. I think anybody who's worked in this building knows of the advocacy of disability rights. So I appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much. It's really quite an honor to be here with so many legislative champions of disability rights movement. So I want to thank all of you for the work that you've done and let you know how much we look forward to working with each of you in the future. And I also want to acknowledge your staff person and all of his work in putting together the hearing. I know doing such is quite an undertaking. So thank you for that. I, in part, was asked to talk about the history of the disability rights movement and the Lanterman Act. And because my colleague Paul has so eloquently talked about that, I think I will not go through that again, except to make a couple of notes. What we know is that the history at the beginning up through the middle part of the 20th century was really, in many ways, a history of discrimination, and a history of discrimination that led to denial of very fundamental rights for a significant segment of people who live in this country. Required sterilization, denial of the right to vote, denial of the right to marry, requirements that people live in institutions because we did not want to have them part of the larger society. What we also know, and I think what Paul alluded to, is that California, while it has that history, was also at the forefront of changing some of that history. And the Lanterman Act is a piece of history-changing legislation that makes a difference both in terms of attitudes and rights for people with disabilities. It is of interest to me that probably in a hearing room much like this, on the Assembly side, that the Lanterman Act was born. And it really started with a presentation by what was then called the Department of Mental Hygiene. That should tell us something about our history, that we had mental hygiene, that looked at the increasing number of people with developmental disabilities who lived in institutions. In the mid-60s, the numbers were 13,000 people, and there was a request to build somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000, or accommodate 2,000 to 3,000 additional beds because of the waiting list to get into institutions. A waiting list, I presume, because it was the only place that individuals could get access to services. And in a moment, I think, of incredible forethought, the Assembly said there's kind of got to be a better way to do things, and it's from that realization of we can't just provide services in institutions. Let's look at some alternatives that the Lanterman Act and the regional center system was born. And it started with 2 regional centers that were pilot projects. Their mission was to really look at the waiting list of people getting into institutions and say, is there a different way we can provide services? Are there alternatives to that? One was in Northern California, one was in Southern California. And at the end of the pilot projects, the waiting list had ended because there were alternative ways of garnering community support. And from that, we then created a regional center system under the Lanterman Act that since that time has expanded to include 21 regional centers throughout the state of California, and a shift in how the state views its obligation. I think the cornerstones of the Lanterman Act are starting with the fact that it says California accepts a commitment to a responsibility for its citizens with developmental disabilities and an intent that agencies serving persons with developmental disabilities demonstrate that their services have resulted in consumer or family empowerment and more independent and productive and normal lives. We also know in California there's a long history of budget deficits. I was pretty fascinated reading back through the history of the Lanterman Act to note the first court case, and the most significant case was really the result of some tension over how we were going to fund services through the regional center system. That case called the ARC, what we now call ARC, Association for Retarded Citizens case against the state of California, was brought because the state was imposing restrictions on the funds that could be available to provide services. And the California Supreme Court in that decision held that the Lanterman Act defines a basic right and a corresponding basic obligation. The right which it grants to the developmentally disabled person is to be provided with services that enable him to live a more independent and productive life in the community. The obligation which it imposes on the state is to provide such services. These services are to be determined through the individual program planning process and provided as an entitlement. So it is in that context of tight budget times that the Supreme Court spoke about the obligation the state has to individuals with developmental disabilities, the obligation to look at service needs individually and to provide the services that will lead individuals to more independent and productive lives. The Lanterman Act also is one of the first places where you see a clear articulation of a core set of values and fundamental rights that people with developmental disabilities, and I would say all people with disabilities, are entitled to. It starts from the premise that people with developmental disabilities have the same fundamental rights and responsibilities guaranteed to all individuals, the right to receive services in the least restrictive environment, the right to dignity, privacy, and humane care, the right to be free from harm and abuse and neglect, and the right to make choices about their own lives. If we live by that set of values and we evaluate our public policy by that set of values, and if we evaluate our budget decisions by that set of values, I think we would be much further along in terms of ensuring the dignity of people with developmental disabilities. I was also asked to talk a little bit about the changing face of the community of people with developmental disabilities. And I think that's actually a very good and important question to ask, because it requires us to step back and say, who is this system providing services to, and what are the public policy implications for the system as the face changes? So using some of the data that DDS provides, I think there's several trends worth noting. First of all, California is the most ethnically diverse state in the nation, and the community of people with developmental disabilities is no different. There is no majority of of a particular ethnic group in California, and in the developmental disabilities system, it is the same. About 58% of consumers would be individuals who identify as a member of one or more of traditional minority groups. We also know that the developmental disability population is aging. When you look just a decade ago about the number of people who are age 52 or older and compare it now, the numbers have almost doubled. There are about 20,000 individuals with developmental disabilities who are age 52 or older, and that's a combination of people being able to live longer and richer lives, which I think speaks well to the kinds of advancements we've made with quality of care and otherwise. We also know, and it's often talked about in the developmental disability system, about the significant increase in the numbers of individuals who have a diagnosis of autism. Over the past decade, that percentage increase is about 260% increase in the number of people for whom that is their primary disability. And we also know that where people live has shifted significantly away from the state developmental centers into community living, and then in a range of kinds of community living arrangements that people might be in the community setting. What's interesting, separate from the data, is what are those policy implications that we need to think about. So what we know is if the groups that you're serving are ethnically more diverse and speak more languages, you need to have service providers and systems that are responsive and culturally competent to provide those services. If individuals are aging, we need to look at what is our expectation and what kinds of services should be available for individuals who are seniors. People with developmental disability should be able to retire from their workshop program or their day activity program, just like the rest of us might someday, when the economy improves, hope to retire as well. And so that's a piece of, that sort of living a, quote, normal life, is the ability to decide, you know what, I don't really want to go to that workshop anymore. I want to be like any other senior. We know for individuals with autism that this is a disability that for many individuals has significant behavioral challenges and lifelong care needs, and the system has to be prepared as individuals age out of the school system to provide the kinds of arrays of services that individuals will need when they are adults. And as we look at developmental centers closing, we need to look at how is the community prepared to provide alternative living arrangements, and where are people living in communities? Are they living in skilled nursing facilities? And I'll talk about that in a little bit in terms of some very alarming concerns we have as a result of some investigations about the quality of care in nursing facilities. But making sure the community is prepared and looking individually at how we can meet people's needs as they're transitioning from a developmental center into the community. So for each of those groups, I think there's unique needs people have, and it's incumbent upon our service system to think about proactively how we will address those needs. You also asked that I talk briefly about the budget cuts and the implications of the budget cuts from the last year. I know that you have another speaker who will be doing that, so I'll be somewhat brief with those remarks. We certainly know that the state faces an unprecedented fiscal crisis, and that the crisis is not remedying itself, at least in the current budget year or probably in the next budget year. As you noted, Assemblymember Chesbro, people with developmental disabilities did not just face the cuts to the regional center system. They face cuts in most every aspect of their life, whether it was from the SSI benefit level being reduced twice last year and a proposal to reduce it a third time this year, in home support services, Medi-Cal. So it is a combination, a cumulative effect of the impact those have on individuals with developmental disabilities that we should all care about, and that we should all look for alternatives as opposed to simply continuing to cut services for people with disabilities. I also believe that the process that the Department of Developmental Services used to identify ways in which the system could address some of the concerns about funding was remarkable. And I think, while not perfect, the fact that the department listened to people through a stakeholder process and an advisory group about alternatives has resulted in some changes that are good and some changes that we need to continue to monitor. So for a moment, I want to just highlight some positive changes that occurred as a result of those budget decisions. And I think sometimes we're all quick to forget some good things that happened in the midst of the ongoing things that remain of concern to us. First of all, the department was able to identify increased use of federal funding. They expanded the array of services that were available under the waiver. And they are poised to become the first state in the nation to have what's called a 1959 in Medicaid lingo state plan amendment that will bring within Medicaid funding individuals with developmental disabilities who qualify for Medicaid but do not meet the institutional level of care required for the waiver. That will be a significant cost savings to the state of California. The department closed Sierra Vista Hospital, identified appropriate placements for individuals, and I hope is continuing to look at ways in which individuals can move into the community who were otherwise placed in other institutions. There's requirements to downsize large community facilities or otherwise ensure that those facilities are eligible for federal funds. I think remarkably, the department engaged in some negotiations with both state and local Prop 10 commissions to look at ways in which there could be collaborations and fund shift to fund some services provided by the department. I think that is a much better approach than ballot initiatives, which failed once and are likely to fail again in terms of mandating any kind of fund shift. There was an increasing the array of incidental medical services that can be provided by respite agencies, opportunities to create more customized employment options. We also believe that several of the changes that were made next year require careful monitoring by the legislature, by the department, and by advocacy organizations, and I want to highlight just a few of those so that we can think through how we're going to make sure that there is not harm to individuals that we all care about. We created a prevention program which was designed to ensure some follow-along services for individuals with less significant disabilities. I think it is our obligation to make sure those young children are not falling through the cracks. There needs to be careful program guidance about the use of insurance and generic services. It's appropriate to require the use of insurance and generic services, but every one of those has a different set of rules, and it can be quite daunting as a family member to try and figure out, how do I get a service from my insurance company, and what do I do if they say no, or they say you only get 8 visits, and how does the regional center go back and backfill those other kinds of services? We need to make sure that the proposal regarding the program for seniors does not diminish the quality of services and care that they receive. We have to carefully look at the respite limits and the suspended services limits to make sure that there's not an increased use of out-of-home placement. And we should quickly move to develop the individual choice budget options so that families can have more choice about how their service dollars are spent, and the service caps for at least that group of individuals can be eliminated. We continued the 3% rate discount, and that is proposed to be continued in this year. I think we all have to recognize that this has long-term consequences if it's continued indefinitely. Most services have had their rates frozen for 6 years, and the discount only exacerbates the rate inequities among service providers. The final note I want to make about the implementation of the budget reductions is in the area of due process protections. What we required in the DD system was that the ship change course very quickly. Regional centers and the department were required within a couple of months to give people notice of changes in their services. And perhaps not surprisingly, that did not always go as smoothly as we would have liked. In our experience, regional centers did not always provide the proper notice, advise consumers of their due process rights, or ensure receipt of aid paid pending. Sometimes inaccurate standards were used, and parents were not advised of exceptions to those standards. We are pleased that we are able to informally resolve many of those due process issues. We again think that's an area where additional guidance from the state, ensuring standard notices, ensuring notices are routinely translated, ensuring that parents fundamentally understand there are exceptions to the the rules and can avail themselves of those exceptions when that's appropriate. Finally, and I'll give you all a copy of this, we had some suggestions. You had asked for future legislation and collaboration, so we're always happy to give you suggestions of things that we think can be improved. We continue to believe in the strong value of the Lanterman Act in terms of promoting integration and inclusion. While the focus has been on downsizing state developmental centers, we also think efforts should be made to develop community options for individuals who live in other kinds of large institutions in the community, skilled nursing facilities, large ICFs. We recently began looking at a group of children with developmental disabilities who are in juvenile facilities in LA County who have a very difficult time moving out of those facilities in any kind of short time frame. We think this can be accomplished in part by expanding the geographic availability of what are called 962 homes, expanding the intermediate care facility nursing waiver, ensuring that supported living is an option at each regional center, looking at supported living-like supports for individuals who live with their families, and we think it's important to collect data on the unmet needs and gaps in the community system. We are excited by some of the work as a separate topic that's being done in employment. Sadly, the vast majority of adults with developmental disabilities are unemployed or underemployed. We think that needs to be approached from both looking at post-secondary education options. There are a number of students with developmental disabilities that now attend college, something that I think people would not have thought possible a century or even half a century ago. But to make that a viable option, we need improved planning and stronger collaboration and shared resources between the Department of Rehab, colleges, and so forth. We need to continue to look at the viability of the alternative custom endeavors option, the CEO program from last year's budget language, and ensure that that model programmatically works and allows the flexibility to providers so that it becomes a viable resource to move people into programs. We need to implement Mr. Bell's legislation from last year, which created an Employment First initiative. We look forward to working with Mr. Amiano around the workforce development issues that he identified. We think it is time to look at the continuation of the sub-minimum wage by which people with developmental disabilities are paid at a rate that is far below what is required for other workers. I mentioned before the need for new and innovative program options. Individual choice budget is one of those, along with options for seniors as the population is aging. I also want to just highlight for you something that I would encourage you to consider having a hearing on, which is the abuse and neglect of people with disabilities. It is absolutely shocking to me that in this day and age that we continue to get reports of people being significantly abused in their care facilities. We just completed a series of investigations of 12 incidents of abuse and neglect that occurred in skilled nursing facilities. These were not all people with developmental disabilities. Seniors, people with a range of disabilities live in nursing facilities. The work that we did with those showed such things as nursing assistants who ridiculed and sadistically tortured 5 male residents, residents who were slapped, struck in the face, sexually fondled, cases where staff members push elderly women in their wheelchairs and release the wheelchairs, causing the residents to sail down the corridor, become injured, a man with very frail skin who was forced into a whirlpool bath despite a large gaping skin tear. None of these crimes were prosecuted as abuse, and California lacks an adequate system for tracking this data. We think we need to amend the Mandated Reporting Act to require reporting of abuse and neglect to both law enforcement and the Ombudsman. It's right now only to one or the other. Integrated data collection systems, additional training, and ensuring that people with disabilities are properly connected with victim assistance programs. But there is much to be done in this state to ensure that people live in safe living arrangements. Abuse, no matter where it occurs, is wrong, and it's our collective obligation to fix that. We have some ideas about how we can ensure better protections in the hearing process and application of due process hearing requirements A lot of those are sort of very detailed kinds of things, so I'll leave that in my materials with you. We also think there's ways you can streamline licensing and quality assurance responsibilities, which would be more cost-effective and perhaps ensure better quality of care, which is what we all care about. And then finally, ensure that services are responsive to the needs of diverse group of consumers served by the regional centers. And that includes ensuring that when we convene stakeholder groups and governing boards, that they reflect the kinds of diversity that we talked about earlier in my remarks, posting data about service disparities, and developing programs that will ensure that the diverse needs of consumers can be met. So just in closing, I will say that really what the Lanterman Act is fundamentally about is listening to consumers and their families. And when we do that, we learn that what people want is really no different than what any of us want. People want an affordable place to live. People want a job. People want the services and supports that will enable them to have a job and have a place to live. And our challenge and our obligation is to find ways to change our systems and provide those services so that those dreams, no different than our dreams, become a reality for every person with a developmental disability in the state. And thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Blakemore, for both reminding us how far we've come, but also how much there is to be done. So there's plenty of work for all of us to do. I have a question for you, but before I ask, I want to welcome our colleague, Assemblyman Steve Bradford, who's joined us. So this question we could have held an entire hearing on, so I don't expect you to give all the details on it, but it's a very important issue, I think a legal issue, and I'm going to be asking Ms. Delgadillo later the same question. When we talk about the cumulative impact of all of these cuts, what sort of jeopardy, legal jeopardy, do you think the state is creating potentially under the Olmstead Supreme Court ruling that we will be failing to provide the supports and that some individuals will be in a position to have a strong legal case to say to the state you've not fulfilled your obligations according to the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Olmstead Supreme Court ruling?
I think the question you've asked is exactly the theory of the two lawsuits that we filed to date, which is the administration's proposals for in IHSS and adult day health care, in fact, eliminated services and supports to numbers of individuals, and we believed that those actions in part violated Olmstead because the state was not able to demonstrate that there were other alternatives by ways in which people could be supported to live in their community. So I believe that any time you make a decision that says somebody's not going to get the services they need to safely live in their home or other living arrangement, that the state jeopardizes its compliance with the integration mandate of the ADA and with the Olmstead decision.
Okay, thank you. Other questions for Ms. Blakemore? Thank you for an excellent presentation. I appreciate it. Our next speaker is one of the most important people for us to have here because he and his organization, I think, really embody what was mentioned earlier, which is nothing about us without us. People First is an organization that advocates, there's a self-client advocacy organization that speaks for persons with developmental disabilities, and we have Joe Meadors, who's the executive director of People First California, and we're very, very pleased to have you.
Thanks for inviting me. Again, who am I? My name is Joe Meadors. I'm the executive director of People First of California. I've been working for People First California for almost 3 years, and I represent hundreds of self-advocates around the state. In fact, I'm leaving tomorrow to Bakersfield doing a training of 50 self-advocates in Bakersfield and Fresno area. And the book that you're receiving is the book that we are training our self-advocates with around the state to meet my peers and friends who shared their stories with me. They have told me that People First has taught them the leadership skills that they made a difference in how their lives and lives their skills and learn in their own community in the grassroots level. I stand before you today as a representative of the state, but I remember that I started my journey in my leadership in my own community in Oklahoma. So what is People First California? People First is the only self-advocacy group organization that is run by and for people with developmental disabilities. We feel if you see us equal but not different and do not include us in the decisions and affect our lives, you will see us as your disabled client. People First believes if you get out of our way and have the opportunity, we have the opportunity to gain the power and knowledge of our own lives, we will become strong and successful. So some of the challenge of the community of people with disabilities. Today, people with developmental disabilities are paid professionals. Look at me. In this field, we are partners which guide the community to make the changes that are needed. People who are a part of a certain quotient can empower people of the same quotient to become strong. There are the only people who can do this to then move the system forward. We know that every community there are people with developmental disabilities who have taken these steps to have a life that is just like everyone else. We want what you want, to live our life, to live our dreams and take our responsibilities, and that comes along with our dream. We know this is hard work, and we are practicing it every day. We give back to our community what we learn, and also mentor our peers so that they can too have the skills to make their dreams come true. So it's a little bit about the disability movement. We fear of what's going to happen. Possible of going back to the development centers and our segregation and living without choices of who we want to live with. We want to make the decisions that affects our lives with the support needed to see them through. We want friends, relationships, paid jobs, and help our transportation to enjoy all things that we can take for granted. We're grateful of what the system has done already for us. So how can the community and people with how can the community of people with disabilities reflect to the current budget cuts and funding restricted? We do not want you to balance the budget on our backs. We've seen our support and service disappear. We are ready for the hard work ahead of us and know the responsibility that comes with the hard work. We need to look at other ways that doesn't take away our abilities to become more independent from the system. If you continue to cut our service support and service, we'll lose our strength and vision for a better life. We need to stand together, unite, and speak with one voice and push forth our vision for the future will be our own. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Meadows. And I just want to emphasize how important it is, both for you and all of the self-advocates who are persons with disabilities to speak up. My own story of interest in the issues associated with developmental disabilities started when I was a member of the Humboldt County Board of Supervisors, and we had a young man in our community who came to the Board of Supervisors every week during the public testimony portion of the agenda, and he was the representative of the local People First organization, and he repeatedly reminded us, the members of the Board of Supervisors, of the importance of learning about the needs and the rights of persons with disabilities, and he started me on my journey, and so hopefully you and others are starting many other legislators and members of the public on their journey of learning to become better supporters of your rights.
And I started in my local community, like I said, in Oklahoma, and as a local 13 years ago on a hot summer day in my local chapel from my brother. And look where I'm at today in California. Never dreamed of be doing what I'm doing today.
Well, we want to cheer you on and support you in every way we can. So
Thank you very much.
thank you for being here. Any questions, Mr. Bradford, for any of the panelists? Well, I want to thank you all again for being here and setting the context for this committee's work. And I think we're going to have a great run and do a lot of great work together under, unfortunately, difficult circumstances. So thanks. So while we're transitioning panelists, I want to talk a little bit about the next panel. It's entitled Dollars, Cents, and Sensibility, Keeping the Budget Cuts Away from Consumers. Throughout the state budget process, the legislature has approved the governor's proposals for $334 million in reductions and tasked a stakeholder group to discuss further mandatory cuts to many services and programs for people with disabilities. We're going to ask representatives of the area boards and the State Council on Developmental Disabilities to discuss how cuts are being implemented and the fiscal challenges that lie ahead. We have both Rocio Smith, Executive Director of Area Board 5, and Randy Knott, Vice Chair of the State Council on Developmental Disabilities. So is Randy here?
I don't think Randy's here.
Okay, well, we have Rocio. It's good to see you again, and very much appreciate you coming and, again, discussing difficult topics, but ones that we all have to face if we're going to get through this in a positive way. So,
Yeah, thank you very much. And I understand. Well, first of all, it's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. And I'm a little intimidated, but that's okay.
You know me well enough to not be intimidated.
Good. Good.
And I know Steve Bradford well enough that I can tell you that you don't need to be intimidated by him either. So just try to relax and participate. It's a conversation, is what it is.
Right. I am here representing the State Council, which is a federally and state mandated agency, and it is federally funded. What we want to do is to promote independence, productivity, and inclusion of people with developmental disabilities. And we do that through the work of area boards, the council, and grants that the council funds. There are 13 area boards. Their boundaries correspond to boundaries of regional centers. And we all try to work together, and that's why I landed here today. I want to acknowledge the work of the stakeholder group that we have talked about the trying to achieve the $334 million reduction in general fund. And I want to echo what Catherine Blakemore said about the great things that, the additional federal funds and some changes in the way we do things that will basically make sure that people with developmental disabilities live as independent, productive, and full lives as we each can. But what I was asked to do here today, or what I understood as what I was supposed to do here today, is to give a face to the cuts, to how the $334 million reduction has impacted people. As we know, the impact was broad, but it had some places where it was focused. One of the places where it was focused is the Early Start program, which is the program for babies who have developmental disabilities, developmental delays, or are at risk of developmental delays. Eligibility in that program was changed, and it was changed so that children who were considered at high risk for developmental delay are no longer eligible for the Early Start program, but are now being redirected to a prevention program, which is just getting off the ground. And as I will echo again, Ms. Blakemore, we need to follow that and make sure it is working and how it is working. This morning I was at a meeting in Marin County, and one of the early start providers was telling me that in Sonoma County, the numbers of families who have decided not to go with prevention but just basically forget about it is pretty significant. So that is something we need to monitor, is what is happening to those kids that we were following before, that we were providing the support that they needed to not need services in the long run.
Can I interrupt you and just ask, is there a gap as well between the demise of the eligibility for early start and the availability of the prevention programs, or is there pretty much a seamless?
Well, as with a lot of things, it changes from place to place, but this was a pretty rapid change, and in rapid changes, things are not always in place. So I will say that a lot of the changes that happened with the cuts do show that we are confused and that we do not know how to manage things. So eligibility is one of them. But another piece in Early Start was the requirement that families use their insurance or Medi-Cal for services. And that has caused, in my community, significant confusion and problems for families. We had a town hall meeting where we invited the members of the legislature in our community not too long ago. And this couple, Genaro and Adela, came with their son, Jesus. Jesus is 17 months old. He has Down syndrome. And he had been receiving weekly visits at home from a physical therapist to help him in all his developmental things. But because it was a physical therapist, the regional center required that they go and find PT through Medi-Cal at Children's Hospital, which is our major resource of Medi-Cal services in our area. What happened there is that in the interim, there were 6 or 7 weeks in which Jesus got no services. Then they did get 3 sessions at Children's Hospital, and then Children's Hospital said he doesn't need PT. So he's back on, let's figure this out, let's get it in paper, and it's on a month-to-month basis, causing great anxiety to the family. The other thing is that for families like this family, going to a place instead of having it at home, when you do not have transportation, where you have to use public transportation to go to a place that's far away, when it is raining, when it is cold, when your children are fragile, adds to the angst and to the difficulty. Parents are committed to get their kids what they need, and they're committed to do what they have to do. But they are being, it is problematic. There is another family who also, because they have insurance, were told to use their private insurance for their therapy. This family has also tried to get the therapy sessions at Children's, but the capacity of Children's to provide the therapy on the schedule that these families need it, even if it is paid for by the insurance, and even if the family is willing to pay the copay, has become a challenge to many people. So they do not have a steady schedule like they used to have. And it causes anxiety, causes problems, causes dismay. I went to talk with pediatricians at Contra Costa Medical Center. They called me to see if I could come and explain what had happened. And they themselves are very confused because they didn't know where to refer. I said, continue referring to regional center as always. But the issue again was the therapist, and they said if the child is in the medical plan for the county, we know how to refer. If the child has CCS, we know how to refer. But if the child is in straight medical, we do not know how to refer. So it's an issue of potential confusion at every level. Case managers are also having confusion as to what to do and all of those problems. So that's early start, and that's just a peek into some of the issues with early start. There are others. I want to go to the other changes, the limits on respite and the suspended services. Many families are not aware that the one service that they use all the time, which is camp, has been suspended. Camp sounds like fluff, like something that everybody does for their kids. Well, for kids with developmental disabilities, many times it is the only time when families can feel secure that they're leaving their kid and their kid is learning independent living skills. When they can take that week from the constant care, and that is an option that until the independent choice budget model becomes a reality, is not available. So one of the things that I would like to request or suggest is that we try to give the regional centers flexibility within their budgets, within the limits that have been given now, for families to do some trading so they can trade services for which they are eligible and which everybody agrees they need for services for which they are no longer eligible. Social recreational services. We had a mother who came and told us her story. Her son is 17 years old with autism. When the child was young, he had self-abusive behaviors, he had aggressive behaviors, he had no language, he had all the typical signs of autism. This family was very lucky in that they identified that their child had a problem because their best friend also had a child with autism. So this child actually benefited from very early intervention and from behavior intervention. And the child is doing beautifully, and they are looking at college as a reality. He did very well through grammar school and the beginning of junior high school, and then his social life deteriorated because he doesn't read social cues, because he doesn't understand how to do that. So he had a service where another young man would help him learn to be a typical teenager, and they would do things that is
Which, of course, as adults, we may not be that happy with, but in
Right.
terms of socializing with his peers, that's a
right.
good thing.
But this is the one
I know
thing
what you meant.
that holds that family together, and that is
course,
one
yeah.
of the services that was suspended. And again, if we were to give flexibility to the regional centers, this family doesn't need other services which they may have to use now. They need that one.
I think there's a lot of value to that suggestion, and one that we should
Yeah.
look at and work together on.
Right. The other, so thank you. And I'm changing gears again to a different one, which is the loss of medical optional services. When optional services for adults in medical were put into place, were taken out, regional centers were given the responsibility and the duty, as they have, to try to provide them. Well, Tom Tom has been in supported living for a little while, and his supported living agency is excellent. So they started dealing with a lot of dental issues that Tom had. So he had 5 root canals, the last one in June. Come July, there is no way to cap those root canals. There is no way to do those services because Medi-Cal won't cover them, and it's considered a different service from the root canal. So his supported living agency tried to get him services through the outpatient clinic at Agnews, but they were not positioned to do the services he needed. He got such an infection that he ended up 3 days in the hospital, where the hospital took care of the infection, but not the dental problem. So finally, his dentist did, his previous dentist agreed to bill him for the service, and Regional Center will cover the bill. But most dentists are very hesitant to be vendored at this point from by the Regional Center. Now, that's one of my areas. I cover through Area Board 5 counties, and it's 5 different stories. In some other counties, the dental issue is not an issue because there's clinics who are doing it, but in some counties, it is a real serious issue. So that is a problem, and it has been a problem. The Regional Center is doing due diligence in trying to get dentists, but it's not easy. I am also very concerned about the governor's proposal to eliminate IHSS services for anyone with a functional index of under 4. And the reason I'm very concerned is that it seems to us that IHSS is now preparing themselves for that by giving functional indexes under 4 to people in serious need. And Ernesto is 14 years old. And the only thing that Ernesto can do on his own is breathe. Ernesto needs total care. But somehow IHSS has given him a functional index score under 4. And we found out because that mother is aware that this isn't right and brought it up and is challenging it. But how many other people will find themselves in that same situation that Ernesto finds himself, who needs total care, has a devoted family, and thanks to that he would never suffer, but he is eligible and he's being denied. He's potentially going to be denied the services if this happens. Those are I think, the major ones that I wanted to focus on as far as the rubber hitting the road in our system. There are other services. There are many families who are making do with less respite, who are not making do and are in dire straits, who are in trouble, but I have to acknowledge that people are trying to do their best given the new constraints that that came under the budget last year. The other question in the letter was, what do we see as fiscal challenges ahead? And I am very concerned about those kids who are now being either put in the prevention program for just follow along, who may or may not, the parents may decide that because they're put in the prevention program, there's really no problem with them and not do much or whatever. Those kids are going to hit kindergarten at the same time that the current stimulus funding for special education disappears. And I am concerned about the impact that that will have in the state of California when we find kids who would, through prevention, might never have needed special education, will be finding themselves in need of special education at a time when the budget for special education will again see a lack of federal support like we need. It was brought up, the 3% cut. We have to remember that the regional center system is really a public-private partnership. Most people who provide services to people with developmental disabilities are private entities, for-profit or non-profit, but private entities. And what we are seeing is loss of jobs because people are cutting down. And what we're also seeing is further erosion in quality. Terry called me the other day. Terry is a young man with developmental disabilities who, when I first met him, I did not know he had a developmental disabilities. He would come to my house to do whatever odd jobs because he needed a little bit of money here and there, and then I found him at the lobby of the regional center, and the light went on. But when Terry used to come to my house, Terry was into drugs. He was just in bad shape. He has cleaned his act. He has worked hard. He has mental health issues besides developmental disabilities. Went to a program for dually diagnosed people and is now living in a community care facility, doing well, and tries his best to be a man. He wants a job. He is in a day program that has a work component, not in a work program, but in a day program that has a work component. His last check was for $3.15, and Terry was despondent. And we need to change that. We need to work on helping people who want to work, who will be good workers, to stop being used. So, thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation and giving us a little taste, a dose of what's out there in terms of the impact of what's been going on. A couple of things come to mind. One is we had several times earlier in the earlier panel talked about cumulative impact, and you're, I think, in demonstrating with the individual stories how these things converge and really create a very dangerous situation, a situation that's damaging to the clients as well as the consumers as well as their families. The other thing that I know there's lots of increasing amount of research on, but you've anecdotally touched on, is how much of what can be done can not only prevent greater levels of disability later in life, and we can do prevention, but we also ultimately wind up with people being less of a burden to the taxpayers, and that can be everything from a child not receiving adequate services so their disability is greater later in life, but in the very specific situation of the dental work you were talking about, simply costing us because there had to be hospital treatment of those infections.
Exactly.
So you pay one way or the other, and of course the individual pays in really unfortunate ways in terms of suffering and lack of capacity and capability in their lives. So those stories are very...
And that individual was very lucky to have a committed agency who would not stop until he got his care taken care of. I am sure there must be other stories which we do not want to hear, but the pain is there. Well,
it's multifaceted. It's both the personal suffering and also the fact that it's also penny wise and pound foolish in terms of the well-being of the taxpayers over time. For us to not be investing in the health and the independence of these individuals.
When I talked about CAMP, one of my friends who's a supported living and independent living agency, she says that when she gets a referral for independent living, if the person has been to CAMP, she knows it will succeed. Otherwise, it's harder. And that is because of that ability to live away from home and become more self-reliant, which people with developmental disabilities seldom have an opportunity to do.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Do you have any questions, Mr. Bradford? No. Okay. Thank you, Rocio. Okay. Our final, call it a panel, but it's kind of more like the hot seat. But Terry is such a good friend that it won't be too hot. It'll just be warm. Terry Delgadillo, who is the director of the Department of Developmental Services, will be discussing the implementation of past legislation, potential plans for the future, and the governor's reductions in the DDS budget and how the department is responding and working to try to make the best of the circumstance we find ourselves in. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and I do want to recognize your staff person who did a phenomenal job of putting everything together. One thing I learned is when you come last, everything you're prepared to talk about's typically been said. So I'm going to not go over repeat a lot of the stuff that we've already heard today from very eloquent speakers before me, but try to focus in on some of the issues that maybe we haven't, and then obviously you have several questions that maybe I can be responsive to. First of all, just in quick summary, I do think, as Mr. Longmore explained earlier, there's been a drastic change in California in terms of how we view and how we serve people with developmental disabilities. Many, many years ago, the only option that was provided to the families when they gave birth to a child with a developmental disability was a suggestion that they be placed in an institution. Today, there are a number of options available, and the institution population has dropped quite significantly. As Ms. Blakemore mentioned, at the height, which was in 1968 for us, we had 13,355 individuals in 13 different state institutions. Today, we run 5 facilities, 4 developmental centers and 1 community facility, and we have 2,145 individuals that are served there. At the same time, our population of people that we've served has grown dramatically. We're up over 240,000 individuals that are receiving services through our system. And as I just mentioned, the majority of them, less than 1%, receive services in state facilities. As we look at the changes in the community, I think it's important to note, though, that there are 2 very different systems. And I'd ask, hopefully you've received 2 documents that just give you some background information. And what we did was just do a 10-year look so that you could see recent data between the year 2000 and the year 2010, both for those in developmental centers and for those in the community. And what that will show you are the differences in the age, so that you can see the change in the population. In the developmental center side, you'll see the shift of the population largely to individuals who are older. You will also see, in terms of diagnosis, some shifts as well. On the community side, you will see the change, as well as Catherine mentioned earlier, that there are about 20,000 individuals who are over 50 years of age. At the same time, we're seeing a large increase of individuals coming into our system who are individuals with autism, and that is changing the service delivery system. So as we look at where we sit, I think that a number of things. One has been the transition. A number of state-operated facilities have closed. In the recent years, since I took over, it's been 4 years ago now, 2 facilities have closed, Agnew's Developmental Center and Sierra Vista Community Facility, both of which closed in 2009. I want to focus for a second on the Agnew's Developmental Center closure because it was something that was unique. It was unique in the nation, and thanks to the chair in many ways for us having the opportunity to do it very differently. It was a process, however, that was over 6 years in length, and so when we started back in 2003 with the idea, that predates me being there were a lot of people with great foresight that put forward new models and new services. We created what we commonly refer to as the 962 homes, which the chair authored the legislation to allow us to provide enhanced services in the community for people that have enduring medical needs, but that may not need to be in a nursing facility. And we've been very successful in getting those up and operational in the Bay Area. We also, and I say we, the system tried some new things having to do with what they call family teaching homes, where they would have a home where a family would live, for example, in a duplex on one side and the consumers would live on the other side, and they would provide support to each other. And those models, while they hit a few bumps in the road early on, are up and operating and seem to be doing really well.
I've been really wanting to come over and visit and see the results, so I know Rob's been working hard to try to get it worked.
I think we have a new date. I think,
I'm really looking forward to that. And of course, I know I'm jumping ahead of you probably, but I want to hear what the implications of that are for Lanterman.
I think as we've learned a lot from the closure of Ag News. We learned a lot in the area of the types of services that would be provided. We learned a lot in the transition process and making sure, as Joe said, don't do anything without us, starting the process early and engaging each individual consumer in their each individual plan and looking at a health plan for them where they're involved from the start all the way through. We also learned in terms of developing health transition plans and coordinating those services, and we did and we still operate a clinic at Ag News Developmental Center, although the usage of that has dropped quite significantly. I was surprised by Rocio's comment about someone not being able to get dental there. Right now, the majority of people that we're seeing never lived at Ag News because it's available to people in the community, and the majority of the services that we provide are dental. So people are coming from the community for dental services. We've got very few Ag News residents who have been returning. So as we look to the closure that we announced last Friday, I think that we have a lot that we've learned from Ag News that can really help inform us. The most important thing that I think is starting from day one is for all of us to be talking to people directly and frequently. I know a lot of people expressed surprise about the closure on Friday without they were hoping to be given a heads up. The one thing we wanted to make certain is that when the staff and the families heard about it, they heard about it from us. They didn't read about it in the paper. And I think that we were successful in that, although I know some are not happy that they didn't know beforehand. But for us, we wanted that personal touch, and I think that's going to be important. We are looking at a much more expedited time frame in terms of development of the plan. There was about a year, I think, when it was done previously. We're now looking at 2 months. I'm really hopeful that Ag News is very informative to that. 2 months for us to develop a plan that we will give to the legislature, and then there'll be between April and whenever the legislature approves it, time for review and modification. But by statute, by law, we have to provide to the legislature by April 1 of the fiscal year preceding when we would start any of the closure process, a plan for their review. And that's what bumps up against the April 1 deadline is the existing statute. So we will be following that. We will be holding meetings with the family members at the facility, with additional meetings with the staff at the facility. We'll be doing a public forum, and we'll be meeting with our stakeholders to try to gather input. And again, it's a starting process, and what we'll put forward is a plan that will obviously have public review as well before the implementation would start. As we came into the last few years, really since I got in office, I joke with one of my predecessors sent me a note one night, and he said to me, "I miss my old job," and my response back was, "It ain't." Because in the days that he was there, they weren't facing the budget difficulties that we're facing today. And those budget challenges have required us to do things that none of us, not a single person in this room, ever wanted to do or ever hoped to be in the process of doing. When the cuts came down, it wasn't choosing between us or another department, it was everybody. And so we did do something different. I know some aren't enamored with the approach we took, but I think for the most part, most are. And that is we just brought everybody together and said, okay, the department has to put forward reductions, but we want to be informed by your expertise. We want to work with you, get your input, get your expertise, so that what we put forward, if it is adopted, has the least onerous effect on the people that we serve. One of the questions that you asked earlier of Catherine was whether or not we felt that the Olmstead decision might be a basis for raising concern with our reductions. I don't know, because I think we put into place some safeguards. We put into place an exemption process on everything that we did that allows for an exemption if there's a special circumstance. We maintained all of the existing fair hearing rights to make certain that people had another mechanism of recourse. The other thing that we've done that Catherine mentioned is that we're trying to resolve issues as they come up. So as opposed to us ending up in a litigious arrangement when an issue comes up regarding a hearing notice, for example, Catherine, myself, the Regional Center Association, the State Council, we talk about the issue and we try to resolve it and move on so that it doesn't have an effect on other people. It's going to be an ongoing process to implement the reductions, because unlike a reduction in another department that just cuts a program or reduces a program, we did 25 changes. and that was on top of the 3% payment reduction. So implementing 25 changes, some of which, ran all the way from an impact of $1 million, and we're a $4 billion budget, upwards. So we're developing systems, and we've got systems in place to try to monitor everything that we possibly can to see, are there adverse effects? Are there things that have occurred? Are we going to live within our budget? We're really hopeful. I'm really glad that when the budget came out in January, it recognizes all the hard work that we did. While there are still some reductions, which in particular the continuation of the 3% for one additional year, it does recognize that we took the reductions. And while other departments may have intended to, lawsuits or other matters may have precluded that. In our case, we did take the reduction, and we were given credit for doing so. So I think we start in a position that is far better than last year when we were facing the $334 million we were facing last year was basically tied to a no-growth budget. When we prepared our budget last year and submitted it to finance, that was the amount of general fund increase that we needed just if we grew on what we expected to be the natural. And so the direction that we were given was basically to have no growth. And so the 334 last year did reduce the growth. And then in this year, the growth is down significantly again. We're at about 4% growth. The two charts that I handed out that had colored pictures were really just back when I first got here and the year after, there was a lot of discussion in the legislature having to do with the rate of growth within our program, and in particular concern that between the year 2000 and the year 2007 that we had a 75% growth in expenditures. And we asked Acumen, who is a company associated with Stanford University, to take our data system and tell us what that meant. Tell us what were the cuts associated, or not the cuts, the increases. What were the increases associated with? And I think the large chart that you see there basically breaks down. They were able to isolate the increases in expenditures associated. For example, 24% was associated with people moving out of developmental centers. 43% was associated with new consumers coming into our system. 11% was associated with utilization. 13% was associated with legislative and budget augmentations. At the time, there had been a 3% rate increase, unlike where we sit today. And there had also been minimum wage increases and changes in rates for supported employment. We also then said, okay, once you're doing that, now tell us where the expenditures are. And what we found in the two smaller pie charts I think is very important. First of all, 82% of the money that we were spending during that period of time was associated with providing services to 25% of the population. Within that, 38% was associated with providing services to 5% of the population. That's not an anomaly in the health and social services arena. You see that also in Medi-Cal and other places as well. We then said, okay, within that 5% of the population that receives the most in terms of expenditures, tell us what the funds were associated with. And the second pie chart there basically shows, residential and supported living services combined come to 67% of the expenditures. But this just gives you a flavor. And this was back through 07, 08. And in 08, in the last fiscal year, we were held at no growth. And this year, then we have it 4%. When we looked at this, we also found that there are changes in our population, and you heard it today. The people that we're serving today, many of them are individuals that are diagnosed with autism. Today, we've got about 50,000 people in our system that are individuals with such a diagnosis. We're also seeing that on any given quarter, so any 3-month period of time when we receive data from the regional centers, that 60% of our intake are individuals with a diagnosis of autism. So we're seeing a significant increase. We also know that providing services to individuals with autism are typically, the cost of those services are typically double other populations. And so we're seeing a growth in that factor as well. So as we look ahead, I think I've covered, and I can get into more specificity as it relates to the budget and the $334 million in reductions. But there were a couple of other issues that the committee had asked me to address. One in particular had to be something that's very near and dear to my heart, so I'll jump to that and then we can go back, and that is employment. when I started at the department, the one thing that I was very passionate about was that we lead by example and that we show people, show other state departments, show everybody how successful it can be to employ people with developmental disabilities. And we were fortunate in that the First Lady has a personal interest because of her family connections and her mother having developed the Special Olympics and her brothers involved in issues related to developmental disabilities. She had a personal interest in advocating for employment. Working with her, we were able to have the Chamber of Commerce conduct a survey for us, and the survey basically was asking their businesses, do you hire people with developmental disabilities? If you don't, why don't you, and what would help you? And what are the stereotypes? What are the issues that you found? And we found that, the majority of businesses don't hire, and when they do, it's because they know somebody that has an individual in their family that has a developmental disability. Maybe they themselves do. What we also found was that most of the businesses said, we didn't know that that was an opportunity. People didn't typically apply. We didn't know there were support services. The other thing they said that would help them was to see other businesses that were successful. And some of the stereotypes were other employees won't be comfortable. Our community, when they come in to Starbucks or whatever, will be uncomfortable with somebody there with a developmental disability. They won't be a reliable employee. So working with the First Lady, we developed a video that basically goes to each of those stereotypes, and that video is available now statewide and available on the web, that shows successful employers. That's what it's all about. It starts with a gentleman down in Bakersfield, and he works for Dreyer's Ice Cream, and he's worked there 19 years and not been absent one day. I bet there's no one else in this room that could say that. Not one day. And then it went to the issue of, will the customers come in? Will they be uncomfortable? And it shows a young man at Starbucks and his supervisor saying people drive all over the Bay Area to come to that specific Starbucks to see Jeremy every morning. And so each of the vignettes in the video are to address something that has been raised by the businesses when they looked at why they didn't hire. So that's one component. The other big thing is we've been trying to figure out, so how do we capture the excitement of the consumers coming out of high school, many of whom may be in a work experience program? How do we capture that and not lose that and have them be able to continue on? So we started, and it's still small, but we started an internship program where we're working with the high school and we bring in interns, and we're still trying to bring you one. I keep reminding everybody every opportunity I have, because we try to train the interns so they get into jobs and they can stay in those positions and get hopefully hired into state employment or work in the legislature. We've also created a couple different state employment lists and state employment opportunities so that people can get in, and we've been successful. In particular, we got the interest of Department of General Services. Actually, our Chief Deputy Director, Mark Hutchinson, had a personal friend that worked with General Services that was very interested, so he started hiring maintenance services employees. So we've got a large number in LA, and they're now expanding to the Bay Area, and we're looking forward to them expanding to Sacramento. So on the employment side, I, like everybody else that's been here today, think that, in these very difficult times, it's one of the things that can really excite all of us. I know on the days that are tough for me, they send people in that work for us to cheer me up and remind me that it's keep going, it's a good thing. So I think as we look ahead, obviously we've got a lot of challenges ahead of us, the challenges of dealing with the $334 million in the current year. We've got challenges. We are, as Catherine mentioned earlier, seeking a lot of assistance from the federal government. We've been very lucky in the sense that we submitted 2 amendments to our existing waiver to expand our services, both of which were approved, and that does include covering the optional benefits that were mentioned that Medi-Cal dropped. So we're able to pick that up under our waiver and still get the federal matching funds for that. We are working with them now on this brand new thing called a 1915I, and we're the first state in the nation. And, they had 100 people on our first call. They were all 100 were excited, but all 100 had 100 questions. So we're still noodling through all that with them, but we're very optimistic. I think the closure of Lanterman is going to be the height of our attention, and we're going to be spending a lot of time and energy to make sure that we do that right, recognizing that, we're not probably going to have the amount of resources we had in the past. Cal HFA is not in a position to give us a $100 million bond as they did in the past to buy housing. So there are going to be some challenges, but we've got resources out there as a result of things that happened back in the 80s and 90s. We do have what they call a community placement plan, and every year we put money into every regional center to build the community, and we'll be looking at focusing those efforts. I believe there's close to $90 million in our budget specifically for that, so we'll be looking to maximize that. So I think, I've tried to cover the issues that you raised and not duplicate what everybody before me said, and maybe I can respond to questions or if there's something else you'd like me to address.
Well, first of all, it's hard to use the word congratulations because of the difficulties of what we all face, but I think given the circumstances, the inclusionary process that you've had, inclusive process that you've had to bring people together to try to figure out how to make the best of the situation is to be applauded, and so I will say congratulations, even though we'd rather be going the other direction in terms of resources being available, and we certainly, I hope, will be doing so in the near future as things begin to turn around. With regards to Ag News, you mentioned some of the. You partly answered the question I was going to ask you in terms of comparing the. Lanterman, not Ag News, but comparing the effort to close Lanterman with the previous effort. Some of the resources that won't be available. But I'd like you to, in terms of the abbreviated planning process and time period compared to the time that we had the last time, can you talk about how that might affect the ability to find as many good alternative options for community placement and the resources necessary to support those individuals in the community who are transitioning out of Lanterman?
Yes, I think, first of all, we envision the closure as a three-step process. The first step is getting a plan that'll be a high-level plan to the legislature so we can have dialogue with all of you about that and with the public and others. The second phase is that dialogue and that process, and we'll be having community meetings before you ever see that plan, so it'll be informed by the input over the next 2 months.
That's not part of, it is part of the 2-month process.
Oh, yeah, during the 2-month process, we're going to be talking to everybody. Then you'll get a plan, and I'm sure you all with us will be talking to everybody as well. So between now and July 1 is the soonest at which we would be implementing that plan, and if the plan's not approved by then, obviously, then we wouldn't be implementing it until it is approved. Then the next phase of the process is moving into the closure, and from that perspective, number one, consumers aren't moving until the place where they're going is ready to provide the services, and that's what we did in the case of Ag News. And it did elongate things, but we did learn a lot, and I think that was the right decision for the health and safety of the consumers. Secondly, it's going to be driven individually. It's by each person, and each person, consumer, their family, the planning team, getting together and looking at the health needs, looking at the resources, and trying to figure out what options are available. And I think it's going to vary from person to person. I think that the important thing is that we start the dialogue. I do think in this situation that there may be more going to another developmental center than had in the case of Ag News, because we did have $100 million of homes that were brand new infusion into the community that we still aren't able to sell the bonds to address that. And so I know we're not going to be, in light of this situation for the state's current rating, we're not going to be able to be in a position to do more of that. At the same time, we've been investing in Southern California because the majority of the residents from Lanterman originate from regional centers in Southern California. I think there's only 2 or 3 people from Northern California out of the whole population. So we've been investing in community placement plans for them, and some of them have been developing housing that's now coming online. And so it's got to be an individual process.
I seem to remember with Ag News that we also had some fairly unique partnership in terms of developers who were very interested in being part of and may have had some personal interest in it, in the issue of finding ways for people to live in the community. Do those relationships continue to exist, and do you think that there might be a similar private sector interest in helping us find ways to build some appropriate housing?
Well, I think in terms of Ag News, there was a developer that was involved. It was a multi-pronged approach. It was a developer from up here that helped coordinate the development of the houses. What we have down in Southern California through the community placement plan is all of that stuff has been ongoing. And so each regional center, as they've been implementing their plans, one of the things we require when we acquire housing, when we give them money to acquire housing, is that they have to put up a match. We only put up 25%. And so they're getting developers, they're getting tax credits, and they're getting other types of financial commitments coming into the deal. So we have a lot of that that's been underway. People have been looking at people throughout our developmental center system, and one of the discussions that we'll be having is how do we focus our efforts recognizing the situation that Lanterman is in. So on average, we typically are moving close to 200 individuals a year as a result of the community placement plan. So with that in mind and looking at, we're anticipating it probably being a two-year plus period of time.
Given the work that's already been ongoing, describing it as a 2-year process is a little bit misleading because there's a lot of work that's already been accomplished prior to the announcement of the closure.
Exactly.
So, one other thing that I know was addressed at Ag News was the talent, the workforce, and trying to figure out how to make best use of them and respect their career needs as well as what they have to offer. Is that being looked at similarly in the Lanterman situation?
As you know, we're just starting the planning process, and so we don't have final recommendations on the plan, but we'll be looking at what we did in the Ag News process and trying to look at the best practices. We did a number of things in Ag News that ranged all the way from, we created it was like a skills center. They called it Marchese Center was the name of it, and it was a place where each employee could go in and look for job opportunities. It was also a place that would help them prepare. We also created a mechanism by which people wanted to be cross-trained. And so we had people that, for example, that may have been in food service that wanted to go into direct service where we cross-trained them so that they were competitive in other state jobs. We also had some that actually became care providers and in the community brought people into their own home. There weren't as many of those as we had originally anticipated. We had anticipated early on, and there was legislation by then Assemblymember Lieber that would allow for state employees, in particular from Ag News, to move into the community and continue working. We had anticipated that there would be about 200. We have 94 that chose that path. There were a couple that went in and out, but we've got 94 today.
Of course, we're in a very different economy now, so the range of alternative career transitions might be more challenging, and so yeah. I know our first concern here is the clients, but and the consumers, but I think we also need to think about how to make use of those individuals and look for ways to help them transition as well.
We also found, we worked with our sister departments, and we had over 30% go to other state entities, other like corrections and mental health. I think it was about, I'd have to look at the numbers so I'll make sure I have it correct. I think it was about 18% that went to other DDS activities. So we really tried to maximize everything that was available to them. I think ultimately, and I should look at the exact number of, ultimately when we got to layoff, got the number here somewhere. When we got to layoff, there were 17% that were actually laid off. The remainder, we had 34% went to other state departments, 18% to DDS, 23% retired, and I think we'll see a number at Lanterman as well that are long-term employees that are on the cusp of retiring that may choose that. 19% separated on their own voluntarily early on from state service, and 7 left for other reasons such as termination, AWOL, medical, or they passed away.
Okay. Shifting back for a moment to the Olmsted discussion, you discussed the steps that you've taken that you think help to reduce the possibility of institutionalization, thus reduce the possibility of the state being held having legal liability under Olmsted. But we also talked earlier about the compound effect of multiple cuts, and of course IHSS, Medi-Cal, potentially even healthy families. I had a mom talk to me the other day about her concern about not only her services from the regional center for her child, but also what was going to happen with her access to health insurance through healthy families. So I know I can't ask you to be responsible for all of those cuts. That's not the
I
point.
have a
but-
good answer for you, though.
Okay, good, because it's more than just the services that are provided under your department that can help to bring about the potential for somebody winding up in an institutional setting. So,
I think, and I'm fortunate in this regard, because we have the entitlement, and the entitlement remains intact, even though it's strained, obviously, with the stuff that has happened with the budget. When those programs are cut, money comes into our budget for us to buy those services. That's not necessarily the most ideal, but like the Medi-Cal optional benefits that we spoke about, when dental went away, we received money in our budget so that we can acquire the services. We've been able so far to work with the federal government and be able to continue to offer that under the waiver, so we haven't lost federal money.
would that be, I know this is prospective because we backfilled Healthy Families this year, but there's the potential for significant reductions to Healthy Families eligibility, and obviously some of the families who are regional center families are at risk because they're not Medi-Cal eligible, but they're Healthy Families eligible. Would that same thing apply to Healthy Families?
To
as
the
applies to
degree,
Medi-Cal?
and I don't know the whole array of services that Healthy Families offers, to the degree that an individual consumer has in their individual plan with the regional center a need for a specific service, then under the Lanterman Act, there's a requirement that the service be obtained. One of the struggles, and Rocio talked about it, one of the struggles is maximizing the use of generic resources. One of the things in these really tight budget times is we've got to make certain if there's money available anywhere, we use it. Well, because of the many, many, many years of difficulties with the budget, the other systems haven't been real enamored with picking up the cost. And so like with the private insurance company, that's a challenge that we're trying to work through to make certain that we can maximize the use of that resource when it's available. But the way the statute reads and the way the trailer bill reads is that the regional center still has a responsibility to provide the services that are in the individual program plan.
One last question.
Okay.
And that is, as you well know, each regional center is an independent nonprofit corporation and contracts with the department to provide services. During this last year's challenging budget cuts, did each regional center make their own cuts, or did each regional center realize the cuts in different ways?
And this is an ongoing challenge. The regional center system, there are 21 different regional centers, and the good thing about the Lanterman Act when it created it, was they wanted the regional center to be connected to the needs of the community. And so when the reductions came down, first of all, of the $334 million, $80 million approximately was us getting additional federal money. So that's not affecting the regional center. There was an additional amount, which I don't remember off the top of my head, that was specifically related to DC, such as the closure of Sierra Vista and some other things that we did. The amount that related to the regional center side, though, before we allocated the amount out to each regional center, we took that off the top. So the amount that we had to allocate was lower. We then dispersed it through the normal process. The problem that we faced with so many different changes all at once is each regional center is not the same. So some regional centers, and I'll use the case of Redwood Coast, which is in your area. Redwood Coast does not have the luxury of a public transportation system that can pick up transportation in most cases for other than, very limited areas. On the other hand, San Francisco Golden Gate Regional Center does have, and so does Orange County, they have robust public transportation systems. So to the degree that each regional center will have to make adjustments based on where they can. The other thing that happens is some regional centers have already implemented some of the changes that were in the budget. And so to the degree that they had already done that, they're not going to be able to garner additional savings related to that.
Okay, I thank you very much. And again, I thank you for all of your good work and for being willing to continue to face the challenges that are being thrown at the department and trying to help buffer this very, very important community as best you can. So,
thank you. Thanks for your support.
This brings us to the public comment portion of the agenda, and we have several people who've asked to speak with us. I'd like to start with Christina Mills from California Foundation for Independent Living Centers.
Sit or stand, Mr. Chiswell?
What's that?
Sit or stand?
we could actually invite people to come on up. So let me just, let's see, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 microphones. So Christina Mills, Laurel Mildred, Greg DeGear, and Randy Hicks have each asked to speak. And if there are others, we'd appreciate it if you'd, where are the forms located? There's forms outside on the table. We'd appreciate it if you'd fill one out and give it to the, provide it to the sergeant. So, Laurel.
My colleague Christina Mills is running between hearings. She simply wanted to thank you for your past sponsorship of Capital Action Day, Disability Capital Action Day, and to remind you that it's going to be May 26th this year. And she also wanted to follow up on the history discussion by mentioning that Youth with Disabilities in California are running a campaign to promote Disability History Week in the schools. So, my name is Laurel Mildred. And thank you, Assemblymember Chesbro. I represent the Californians for Olmsted, which represent people with all disabilities across the lifespan. We appreciate your long track record of concern for all disability issues and your efforts to initiate this important select committee. In times of fiscal challenges, it's critical to evaluate what works. It's very important to notice that the Lanterman Act and the system that it has developed is the only system that has made meaningful progress in the implementation of Olmsted. That's very significant considering it's been 20 years since the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act and 10 years since the Olmsted decision. We've learned time and again that policymakers have short memories. You've already referenced the experience of the mental health system as a cautionary tale. And community living can be perilous over the long run as times of budget constraints put each and every separate program in the system of care on the chopping block. This never-ending cycle puts the civil rights of people with disabilities at risk every year. Ms. Blakemore referred to the basic right and the corresponding obligation to provide services that allow people to live in the community. Californians for Olmsted believes that the current multi-year budget crises are presenting fundamental decisions about the way our state treats its disabled citizens. The erosion of the Lanterman Act and the essential services to people with developmental disabilities is an indicator, the canary in the mine, if you will, that represents the state's abdication of its fundamental obligations to citizens with disabilities under the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Olmsted decision. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You've all been busy filling out forms, but I think there's just a whole bunch of people who want to talk, so I'm just going to start doing it the way we do it at legislative hearings, and I'll go with Greg and then work our way around the table.
Mr. Chesbro, Mr. Lane, thank you.
If you want to come on up, feel free to come up and sit down.
I'm Greg DeGear. I'm the Public Policy Director of the ARC of California, the state's oldest and largest membership organization of and for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families, and thank you for this opportunity. First and foremost, we'd like to stress that our community is strongly committed to assuring that services and supports remain available for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Our commitment will remain strong despite the barriers that's created by some of the state's budget challenges, which I'll refer to. In 2003, as you know, we experienced a dramatic change in eligibility standards that excluded thousands of people with disabilities from the system. Today, we have no way of knowing where those people are or what kind of help and support they need. In recent years, we've endured hundreds of millions of dollars of unallocated cuts in developmental services, and last year we sustained a reduction to the DDS budget of more than $500 million in federal and state funds combined. The 2009 trailer bill, as has been mentioned, enacted more than 20 changes in our key civil rights law, the Lanterman Act. Some of those were very positive and corrected problems that had existed for a long time. However, others, we believe, diminished the core tenet of the Lanterman Act, which guarantees that individual program plans must be deliberated, developed, and agreed to in a meeting of the interdisciplinary team that includes the individual with the disability and his or her family member or other advocate. Today, we're dealing with the fallout of making so many drastic changes in an act that has been the gold standard nationally for supporting people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. You've heard about, for example, the respite care problems. Another one is the simple adjustments in such as those requiring families to check their insurance coverage have actually turned out to be the source of much grief and anxiety for the families and harm for people with disabilities. families have reported to us that some of their providers have discontinued services because of non-payment from insurance companies. And doctors are reporting to us that they are not making referrals because they've either decided that the regional center cuts have made their patients ineligible, which is arguable, or that the patient will be just referred back to them for further referrals, wasting valuable time between diagnosis and treatment. We're seeking legislation this year on to correct some of those. You know about. One of the bills that has been introduced, left over from last year, is Assemblyman Huffman's AB 1260, which attempts to solve some of the problems with respite care that you've heard about, and also the senior programs. Finally, we're concerned about what we see as the deterioration and potential collapse of many community service provider agencies, including many of the ARC's local chapters that are service providers. Community service providers have carried out the state's promise to children and adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities for decades. They support tens of thousands of consumers and families every day and have subsidized the state's commitment through fundraising and continuous efficiency initiatives. But their options are running out in today's stressed economy, and California's community service system is in grave jeopardy. We know your commitment and your concern, and we look forward to working with you to save our developmental services system.
Well, I appreciate that very much, Greg. I think the provider perspective is one that we very much need to hear, and the system is built on community providers, and especially if we're moving further into the closure mode, we can't have a crumbling community system. I'm going to call on Terry DeBille.
Good afternoon. My name is Terry DeBille. I'm a member of the board of the Parents Coordinating Council at Lanterman. I'm also chair of the Governor's Advisory Board there, and I'm also a member of the Budget Advisory Group at DDS.
What was the last one? I'm sorry.
The Budget Advisory Group at DDS,
oh, okay.
The stakeholder budget group. Thank you for holding this meeting. I was particularly struck by the review of the history in California of the treatment of people with developmental disabilities. And I have to say that it really gives a new understanding of why, in a different century, families came together and started the Sonoma Farm for the protection of their children, which is now Sonoma Developmental Center. The Lanterman families do not want their children segregated. That's not why they are at Lanterman. Indeed, I think I can speak for every developmental center family in saying that. They are there because the services and supports that they need, as determined by their IPP, require them to be there. We know that you and other committee members really understand the importance of this, secondary to your work with the Agnews residents. We feel that the combination of professional staff, secure housing, and quality programs are really vital for our family members. We're very concerned over the budget, which in the past several months has gone down several $100 million, and we wonder how the community can absorb more consumers with complex needs, and not just the loss of funding, but also the other problems that we've heard today. We know that the process of developing the closure plan is just beginning, and our strong and open relationship that we have with DDS, we really appreciate, and I think that will be an asset in this process. And we're appreciative that the Lanterman Act also makes us part of the process. So we don't know what the closure plan looks like, and the legislature doesn't know what it is either, but we are really looking to you to scrutinize the plan carefully, assist it in improving it with legislative support, and to not approve anything if it falls below what our children need. Their lives truly depend on that. And I'd just like to close in saying that, you know, this room is filled with many advocates from different organizations and areas. And over the years, some of us didn't speak to each other. There was a perception that our interests were different, in conflict, or even in competition with each other. Well, they are not. We really have to get the system right, and it's not just for the Lanterman residents, but for everybody in California who's affected by the system. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I have a statement from the Lanterman families, too, I believe.
I appreciate it if you could provide it to the sergeant. We'll get it.
Thank you.
And we'll just work our way back around the table here. So, yes.
Carlene Holden with Easter Seals. I appreciate the leadership for yourself and the other committee members. I have a great deal of respect for all you've done individually and collectively on behalf of people with disabilities. And I know you know these issues so very, very well. So I'm going to really try to be efficient with time and maybe speak to things that we as Easter Seal maybe have a little bit more in-depth experience on. One of the issues I think that we've been very involved in would be people with higher needs coming from developmental centers. And the landscape is very different today than it was 20 years ago. 20 years ago, I remember looking at people who were coming in on new referrals for community services. And at one point, I remember being surprised that 50% of the new people coming to Easter Seal for services had come from developmental centers. But they look very differently than the population today. That was back when there were 13,000 there. Now there's a fewer number, and the needs are much more complicated. And as a result, I've got to give a lot of credit to all of the people within our system because the planning process is much more appropriate. It's much more detailed. It involves a lot more people. It looks at far more things, and for the most part, as people are transitioning, we're looking at about a 2-year process. So as you were having dialogue with Terry Delgadillo, these things have been in process, and I'm just verifying, yes, they have. And I'm very impressed with the progress that we've made and the lessons that have been learned over the years. I think they are being incorporated into the plan. We as Easter Seal will do all we can to assist with a smooth transition as possible. And we understand the fears of parents. My first job out of college was in the back, what was then called the state hospital system. And I have a lot of respect for the people I worked with. And the same would be true today. But working together, this is going to be a big problem, and to do it in the 2-year or 3-year time frame is going to be interesting, and we can do it well if we do it together. I certainly pledge us for that. Some of the other areas where I have some major concerns, by the way, and some specialized expertise would be Easter Seal is an 80-year-old agency that was founded by a father and to serve children's children, and then later through the adult lifespan. We've always been very responsive and a large provider of children's services. So of course the cuts to Early Start, the prevention program, the threats to the first 5, the camps. We have been known for being there to support families for years, and I think that we're feeling the effect of all of those impacts to children's services very, very heavily, and it's painful as we're trying to work our way through it with the insurance billing, and it's painful as we're working our way through families who are either trying to figure out the prevention program or who are choosing not to participate in the prevention program. So we are hearing the stories regularly, and it is touching our hearts deeply. I don't know in this economy what we can do, but I can at least bring a voice to it to the best of my ability. We are also a provider, so I know that we'll be having some testimony as well from others around the table who can be very articulate about that. I can give you some statistics that are sort of interesting that I just looked at this week. Surprisingly enough, or not surprising, as we've either had to cut back in management positions to keep cuts away as far away from possible as the people we support. It's been a theme of Connie's, as we all know. I was giving her credit for that. But I think consistently we've all tried to keep cuts as far away as possible. That meant that the cuts were in management. The cuts were in benefits. The cuts were maybe in increased co-pays, and of course the additional closure days. I think they're definitely showing signs of stress, and I think that as I looked at, for example, our report last week, I clearly noticed increased hospitalizations from our staff, meaning our premiums for health care are going to go up pretty dramatically. More visits to the emergency rooms, meaning our hospital costs, our insurance costs are going to go up dramatically. Workers' comp, again, starting to really go up fast. So, obviously we've taken the cuts and we've continued to take the cuts, but there's other prices that we're paying. And I think those signs of stress are definitely showing up inside the agency and inside the people who are directly supporting our children, families, and adults. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know whether to welcome you back or you should welcome me back.
Oh, I am. I want to say Senator Chesbrough, Honorable Chesbrough, I feel like Linus in Peanuts, like I have my thumb and warm blanket back. It is such an, I mean, as bad as everything is, to appear in front of you again, and the members, and your new staff, I look forward to meeting with you, is really like my thumb and warm blanket. My name is Connie Lapin. I'm on a lot of groups. Too many to mention. One I will mention, Catherine Blakemore talked about the beginning of the Lanterman Act and how the regional centers started. I was the first representative for autism in the Southern California Regional Center when it was when it began. So you kind of know how old I am. My son is going to be 42 this March, and I've been doing this a lot. So I felt like in all of these things, I want to help you have a tape measure or some kind of parameters to judge what's happening. So this is my preamble. I stole this from my husband, the Constitution of the United States, and he said, bring it back. And this is my son's Constitution. This is the first booklet on the Lanterman Act in the early 70s. And I have a preamble to that Constitution, and I say it a lot. I mean, some people in this room, I'm on the stakeholder now called the Budget Advisory Group, and it was an amazing experience, very painful. A lot of Tums on the table. It was a really educational opportunity. But here's my preamble. The cuts have to be farthest from the person, and we really, really mean that. There has to be health and safety exceptions. You talked about, I loved it, legal jeopardy for this state. You were around. I love it that you were around when, remember the Chronicle articles came out? We have to be careful about safety and health. And Title 19 talks about safeguards. Medicaid funding talks about maintenance of effort. So it's not a little thing. IPP has to be the central basis on which we make decisions, even though there's trailer bill language and cuts. And then I know this is going to be a hard sell. I don't know what I have to do for this one. I don't want these to be permanent. I want these to be sunsetted. Lots of things has sunset language, and guess what? You know better than me. Oops, we changed the sunset date. But it would give us hope. We know the economy's bad. Actually, our consumers, our providers, our family members know more than anybody how bad it is for the economy. We want transparency. What's happening out there? How are these cuts playing out? Are we paying a heavy price in the unintended consequences? And I like what you talked about, proxy cuts. It's like if you're not cut one place, you're cut another place. And in LA, there's a drought. So if my son has a lot of issues around the bathroom and takes a lot of showers and washes a lot of clothes. They don't have any kind of waiver for people with disabilities on their bill. I mean, it's like everything is adding up. I'm glad today we're not using euphemisms like system reform and what was the other one? Purchases standards. We're calling it like it is. Budget cuts, cost containment, cost shifts, cost benefit. I think the most important thing I can tell you is the cost benefit. What are we doing? Are we eliminating something here and then having it be more expensive somewhere else? You know that. There's 4 little things I want to mention. They're not little to me, though. One is there's an organization called the National Autism Center, and they put together best practices, and they have a national standards project. And California was mandated under legislation to do their own evidence-based practices. Well, I'm telling you that I think that report is being used incorrectly to eliminate services. There's a lawsuit, I think somebody brought it up, with parents talking about an effective treatment that is not experimental. But one regional center is calling it experimental. Maybe you could call it emerging according to this, but not experimental. So we have to see what's really happening out there. Second, several members talked about the individual choice budget. I think it's a great idea. Do you know how it originated? We were temporarily sunsetting CAMP, really good programs, and that was our way to say, hey, we can save them. If you say that you'll take a cut and you will consent to an individual choice budget, you can have those back with flexibility. However, nobody said they had to be mandatory. And I believe they're not applicable to all services. And then there's my mantra that I'm sure you've heard. It has to do with efficient use of resources. So I'm going to read it. Streamline regulatory relief of duplicative, bureaucratic, redundant requirements sucks up resources. Somehow, I don't get any traction on that. I mean, in the real world, I say things like, tell me the pieces of paper that you have to fill out that don't mean anything. And in the real world, I get a lot of, oh my God. But then when I bring it up in other forums, I don't have any, it's something we can think about. It's an efficient use of resources. And of course, flexibility that was mentioned previously. I know that the light at the end of the tunnel is this huge train. I'm counting on you and others to help us keep it in track and not get derailed. And I'm so glad you're here. And thank you. I will be glad to work with you.
Well, thank you very much, Connie, for your passion and for your longevity at all of this. You're being there for your son and for all of the people who need advocacy. So thanks very much. Randy.
Well, we're glad you're running this hearing here. Randy Hicks, Californians Disability Rights. Ours is a physical disability issue. Now, what's happening now is because of the budget cuts, they have eliminated a program that would have been able to make sure that they can stay in their own homes by A, building ramps, 2, putting grab bars in, and 3, making sure they had wide doorways. That was one of the programs that was eliminated in this budget, in the last budget, because regional centers can no longer go out and do site inspections anymore. That was one of the things about home-based community services. The other thing is that because of the medical optional benefit cut, that they can no longer have waiting times for people to go to the hospital. Like regional centers would have caregivers go out there and say, okay, you can wait for them in the hospital, and then you can pick them up or make sure that they got everything. But what happened is hospitals are no longer they no longer can have people stay in the hospital anymore. That was under the IHSS cut. That was a big deal because what happened is CDR has done a study on people who've gotten Medi-Cal services. And what's happened is when people go out to get Medi-Cal services, they don't understand what's happening. But then again, their caregiver can't stay with them. In the regional center, we'd be able to have caregivers go out there and be with them. That, with the cut in the regional service budget, that program has now been eliminated. I'm going to make this short because we believe that there should be some kind of revenue increases. Of all the programs that are going through this, there has to be some kind of, as Lenny Goldberg put it, the low-hanging fruit that's out there and all the services that could be saved by increasing revenues. We can't have a cuts-only budget. It's not going to work. Californians with Disability Rights believes that we should also support anybody who wants to increase community-based services. Community-based services keeps people independent, keeps them living at home, and they don't have to go into an institution or a SNF. And you know how much SNFs cost. And now they're going to raise the price how much those are with other fees. So I'm going to conclude by simply saying that we have to now look at a comprehensive budget policy that encompasses everybody. When I go out on the street or I ride a train and all of a sudden they can't get there anymore. You live in a regional center, you want to get on a bus, you can't get there anymore. SAC-RT is going to continue to cut transportation services. I think we have to have a broad-based explanation to everybody about what's happening. Not just in this room, not just in this beltway. Yeah, I come here all the time and I try to tell people, but when I get on the train, somebody says, how come I can't go to that regional center anymore? That's way out in Betano Drive. Well, guess what? That bus doesn't run to Betano Drive. They were talking about how you could have other ways of transportation, not expensive ways, like paratransit. Well, you have to have paratransit now because the 8084 no longer goes to Betano Drive where the regional center is.
Thank you, Randy, for being here. Thanks for your comments.
You bet.
Dwight.
Mr. Chairman, welcome back. Dwight Hansen here on behalf of the California Disability Services Association, formerly CRA. This is beginning my 15th year in this field, which is shocking to me. But it's also the most frightening that I've seen because of the challenges, and it's a difficult time. We'll have an opportunity to work together on a lot of the details of this, but I think one of the challenges that we're going forward here is that you really can't pray for a better past. What has happened, and now we have to work going forward to see if we can avoid some of the things that have occurred in the past from occurring further going forward. This process of arriving at these cuts was not unusual for the Department of Developmental Services to gather the stakeholders together, have these discussions is a great idea. But I think it's important to remember that there was just two processes here. There was a $100 million process that had 4 months for discussion. There was a $234 million process added that had less than a month. So the cumulative discussion time over some of these very dramatic impacts was pretty truncated. And it's very difficult, and in the environment that we were in, anybody that raised an objection, I think, was looked as if we were swimming upstream. And that really isn't the way the process is supposed to work. You're supposed to have a process to work through all that. The legislature itself made it more difficult because the legislature suspended the hearing process. They suspended the subcommittee process, and as you know, as being both budget chair and subcommittee chair over the years, those subcommittees provide an opportunity for a lot of the detail to be worked out. That simply didn't have, and so we didn't have a lot of opportunities to kind of work through those details.
Well, it's difficult for me to be in any formal way a spokesperson for the incoming speaker, but he has made public comments about moving away from the Big Five process and moving the budget decision-making process upstream and strengthening the traditional constitutional process that once existed. So that makes me hopeful that there will be more meaningful subcommittee processes.
I think from a community like this standpoint, that has to happen because otherwise we just don't get the detail in. The reality is that the impacts that occurred in those $334 million now occur in the budget as a block grant, if you will. We still don't know the details of how all those things are going to come out. If, for example, we're going to save $1 million in one category and the legislature voted to do that, that's one thing. But if that turns into $20 million, or we're going to save $5 million on respite and we're going to save 50 instead, we need to know that. And the department, I know, is struggling to get the data together to provide that input. But when we're looking going forward with potential other cuts, we really have to know what we've already done. Cutting camp and some of those respite issues can be very, very damaging if out-of-home placement is the result, respite services. So we've got to be careful about that, and until you get that kind of information and can do the oversight, we'd ask for a great deal of caution about that. Just very briefly on a couple of other issues. On the employment services, there's a lot of lip service being paid to employment, and as you know, over the years, sometimes those hearings on employment have been pretty lonely places. Now everybody's talking about employment. But it really takes a link between the employer, that willing employer, and the worker. And we have to work those things out where the person that is hiring somebody gets their money's worth for that labor. We all work in a labor market. I would love to mandate that every single person with a developmental disability is given a living wage. I don't know how to do that. I don't want to see a situation in place where only those folks who are the most productive are going to be able to work, and those folks with the most severe disabilities can't. And I fear that some of the things that we're talking about now going forward could in fact lead to more unemployment for people with severe disabilities than we currently have with supported employment, being able to put people together. It's not about paying low wages. It's about getting people jobs that they can do, be productive members of society, and build their wages as everybody else needs to do. The last issue deals with the closure of the developmental centers. I can't tell you how thrilled we are with the announcement of the closure of Lanterman Developmental Centers. My organization has joined other organizations for years calling for the closure of these DCs. There are 4 major categories of the DD budget: the developmental centers, the headquarters, the purchase of services, and the regional center operations budgets. They were not treated equally in this last phase. And in particular, the developmental center budget was left alone. The drop in caseload in developmental centers has been dramatic year after year after year after year, and yet the overall budget of the developmental centers has not fallen that much. A lot of it's the overhead, a lot of it's the issues that are built into that. We can't continue to go after purchases of services, which took the huge bulk of these services, and leave alone our administrative overhead, our regional center operations, and developmental centers as if those also don't exist. So it's a thrill to see this thing happen. Ag News provided a template, but it didn't provide all the answers. There were things done in Ag News, I think, that everybody will agree were way more expensive than they needed to be. And we need to look at those areas and determine first and foremost that what we want is a place for the people coming out to live and be productive members of society. Civil rights of the workers that are in the developmental centers, I'm sympathetic to them as well. But we really need first and foremost to make sure that the folks have a place to be. Bringing a person with that worked in the DC out at 3 or 4 times the wages of a community worker and asking them to work side by side with somebody else, it's going to be very difficult to administer and very expensive as well. So we just need to make sure that we think those things through before we take on the added burden of providing guaranteed employment My folks have been laying people off for years. We've been frozen in many cases since 1998. So we know about middle management freezes. We know about cuts in benefits. We know all those sorts of things. It's difficult for our folks to hear, and they'll be watching this on TV, how much concern we have for the state employee when we haven't really expressed the same kind of concern for the community employee doing basically the same work for far less benefit. But nonetheless, the closure of that developmental center will be a huge benefit. We think it can happen. We look forward to working closely with them. We thank you for your leadership on the housing issue. The final issue on that is that in addition to the operational costs of the developmental centers, which should come out into the community, by the way, we don't have a unified budget. We treat these two budgets differently. If it costs $300,000 to operationally serve somebody in a developmental center and $100,000 in the community, it seems like we have $100,000 for community services and $200,000 in savings for the state. We ought to be able to score that. This other side of that, and this is my final point, deals with the capital value. Lanterman Developmental Center is a capital asset. If you sell that and turn it into an ongoing expenses, you've just thrown away the capital asset. You need new capital improvements here in the form of housing. Either through lease or sale of that property, you could get the value necessary to provide the new housing. So let's not leave that thing on the sideline, call it surplus property, have it go into the general fund. I'd much rather see it used to build the housing.
Well, that's a much broader topic than just developmental disabilities, but I will say, as a former and current, maybe future budgeteer, also disposing of capital assets at the bottom of the market isn't exactly the most brilliant way to handle things. You know, it's one thing if you're a foreclosed homeowner, but you know, the people of the state of California invested in these capital assets. You know,
leasing may be a much better asset than selling.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. And before I call on the next individuals, I know there's others who want to speak. There's 3 or 4 chairs here, so others can come on. Others can come on forward. And yes, sir.
Will Sanford, Futures Explored. It's been a number of years. I'm glad you're back. I testified often about employment as in the Department of Rehab years. One of the key things I think that we all know about the Lanterman Act is it's not a static act. Never has been. It's always been growing, changing. You led a number of hearings that really evolved the system into new and dynamic ways to support people in their community, to build inclusive communities. One of the things I think we need to really remember and look at is the $334 million in cuts, which is really significantly more, because that only is the general fund piece. There was really significantly more cuts, was done very quickly without necessarily the time to say, gee, was this the best way to do some of this? And I think we need to not hold those things locked in stone, but to look at, and are there ways to generate those programs given more time? I mean, given the time frame, the group, and I will admit I was a member of that group, as they often name the cuts after me anyway, so it's okay. But I think we would really want to go back and look at, especially in the employment area. I think there are ways that the alternative employment program really could work. The way it's structured, it's fiscally almost impossible to make it work. That's just the reality of the situation. But it could be a very viable option. I think the other one that's major is giving families the flexibility to choose how they get their support and relief, respite being one. We've now sort of siloed it versus allowing families to really choose how they get their respite, whether it's camp, whether it's a social rec activity, whether it's in-home or out-of-home respite. I think that's really probably one of the key things that would really help families survive this tight times, so we don't add more things to it. And the other one is, I think I've moved away from the term best practices to what I call promising practices. So we go to the 50s, when we started this conversation, the best practice was state institutions. So if that was the best practice, why are we not still building those? It's really a promising practice, and there's a lot of things we heard about on the autism side. It's developing, it's changing, we're learning more and more every day. So I think we have to look for what's promising, and let's pursue that, and how do we make that one really happen. So once again, I welcome you back. I'm sorry it's going to be a short stay from term limits, but we're glad you're here now.
Thanks very much. Yes, sir.
Boy Bradshaw, Assemblyman Chesbro, and Mr. Lane, I appreciate you for taking the time to go ahead and put this together today. I'm going to be brief because I lack the eloquence of most of my peers. Anyway, today we've listened to a broad variety of issues. I want to go ahead and touch base briefly on residential care issues, simply because it's an important part of the system. As you know, it's one of the most expensive parts of the system. Representing residential licensed residential care facilities, we are looking at a number of diverse issues. One of the difficulties we're trying to figure out is the fact that with the increased programs coming out in residential care, it's actually causing a strain on traditional residential care because you're seeing a dichotomy of services, a lot of costs and expenses associated with the new programs and a lack of continued support to the existing programs. We'd like to enter into that dialogue in the future. Another area that we'd like to go ahead and begin to address, that was brought up earlier, is the issue of looking at issues with regards to abuse and neglect in our traditional residential care programs. And we think it's an important issue that we could certainly work with, and we'd like to begin figure out ways to address a little bit more effectively. The current processes is actually detrimental to the process of protecting the consumers, and we'd like to try and bolster that and change that. Last but not least, we'd like to go ahead and advocate that we do look at strengthening and streamlining regulatory oversight of residential care. Right now we have two different entities providing the same types of oversight, and certainly that creates a redundancy in cost. And we've been advocating that we look at reducing that redundancy to make it increased or to streamline the system a little bit more effectively. Anyway, recognizing that you're getting this new select committee off the road, we were interested in participating, exploring a variety of different areas and stuff, so we'd like to thank you for your efforts and time. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. Thanks for your comments. Who wants to go first?
I will, that's fine. Thanks. Assemblymember Chesbro. My name is Karen Boss, and I'm here representing the Infant Development Association of California. IDA is a multidisciplinary organization of parents and professionals committed to ensuring optimal developmental outcomes for infants and toddlers with special needs and their families. As a statewide organization, we have been advocating for recommended practices in the field of early intervention since 1983. Currently, IDA has 671 members statewide. The California state budget reductions have made significant impacts on the Early Start service system and the lives of families with infants and toddlers with disabilities and those at risk of disabilities. IDA is concerned about these changes as we've been hearing from the field that programs are closing, jobs are being lost, services to children and families are inconsistent, or they're so challenging to obtain that families are choosing to go without needed services, and best practice early intervention research is being ignored. I have a more comprehensive document that I'd like to present to you describing these issues in further detail, and I thank you for the opportunity to provide input during this critical process and for considering the suggested actions.
Well, we're glad you're here, and we'll look forward to reading what you have to submit. Thank you. Yes.
Hello, I'm Gina Guarneri, and I'm from the University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities, also known as UCED, at the Mind Institute here in Sacramento, and we are one of 3 UCEDs in California. And actually, we are partners with the State Council on Developmental Disabilities and Disability Rights California. We're also federally funded. I am going to focus my comments on the California Early Start program and changes, and have a few recommendations we wanted to put forth. I think you've heard today about the impact of some of the changes. One of the concerns that has been expressed, I wanted to restate, was the monitoring of the new prevention program. We feel strongly that evaluation of the new program should occur. Each regional center had to submit a prevention program model or service to DDS. We think it would be important for a review of those models to see how services are being provided. We feel actually the prevention program is a great opportunity as long as it's monitored and services are quality. We also feel, and I think another speaker said this earlier, the importance of monitoring the children in the prevention program. Do they end up going back to Early Start? Are they receiving special education services at 3, at 5, or in 3rd grade when a lot of kids show up? How are their developmental milestones being monitored, and are they being met? Finally, we would like to make the suggestion of putting together a think tank, maybe through the ICC, the Interagency Coordinating Council, or another group, to look at Early Start. We have gone through many changes. We are aware of our budget times, and it would be a good opportunity to put an inclusive group together to re-energize the Early Start program and make sure that we're meeting the intent of the program. And finally, I'd like to say that we're local, and we'd love to help in any way.
Well, very much appreciate that offer and appreciate you being here, and thank you for your comments.
Thank you. And I have a letter that I'll give.
Okay. Good afternoon, old friend.
Hello,
How are
sir.
you?
How are you?
Good.
You'll always be Senator Chesbro to me. I don't care if you're in the assembly or wherever, you're Senator Chesbrough.
I've been referred to as the senior freshman, but then Jim Nielsen, I think, actually trumps me there. So.
There you go. There you go. I'm Rick Rollins. I am going to speak in two different capacities. First, as the legislative advisor to ARCA, the Association of Regional Center Agencies, and we want to, of course, offer our congratulations to you, Mr. Chairman, on the appointment and the creation of this select committee. We think it's very important at a time when our system is under tremendous siege on a number of different fronts to have a select committee focusing on the issues that are near and dear to all of us in this room. We are also very pleased in the membership of your committee. You have a wonderful mix of people who are familiar with our issues and some new fresh faces, I think, that we'd love to get more involved in the DD community. ARCA stands ready to work with you and your staff on this and future issues that come before your committee. As a parent of a child with autism and as an autism advocate, one of the proud things that I've been able to do is be a co-founder of a group called the Alliance of California Autism Organizations. And this is a group of 45 statewide autism organizations that meet on a not so regular basis, but we're in constant contact with each other and have taken positions on a number of pieces of legislation and so forth. We had a big meeting here in Sacramento just 2 weeks ago, and the two big issues that came forward in our group was, number one, the restoration of the early start reductions. We see this as very problematic moving forward with all the good intentions of trying to salvage cuts to a program and spread the program, spread the cuts throughout the system. We feel that this particular reduction is having a very detrimental effect on many children with autism and autism spectrum disorders that would normally be find their way to the Early Start program. The second issue had to do with the initiative that we've undertaken and with the help of many people here in the legislature to have the private health insurance folks step up and start paying for a number of the services that we believe they should be paying for, including ABA services to children with autism. We currently spend about $250 million in the regional center system on applied behavioral intervention ABA services to the kids with autism. If we could save $100 million of that, that would be a nice dent into the state's current budget situation. And lastly, I just wanted to say, as a representative of the autism community on the Budget Advisory Committee, or Budget Advisory Group, used to be called the Stakeholder Group, changed the group that got together with many representatives of the community. I am a strong proponent of that process. I believed in it. I continue to believe in it. I think the Director Delgadillo and everyone who's involved came to the table with all the best intentions to try to save this system from having certain elements of our system being eviscerated from cuts. And nothing is a perfect process, and clearly we need to continue to monitor the implementation of these reductions, but I just wanted to tell you from my personal experience in working with that group that the autism community and many kind of underrepresented groups would not have had a voice in where these cuts came from without the creation of that Budget Advisory Committee group. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thanks for being here, for all you do. Yes.
Thank you for forming this. It's really a wonderful thing you've done, and it's an honor to have a few moments to speak in front of you. I'm Kevin Shields, and I'm the coordinator for the Disabled Students Residence Program at UC Berkeley. It was originally called the Rolling Quads and started by Ed Roberts back in the 60s. My students, my staff teach them to be independent. At first, we do their personal care, and then we help them get onto services such as IHSS and teach them how to navigate those services, which are very difficult. It's like your first year of college taking the double course load and running a small business at the same time, and so it's a lot to learn. And our students are very bright. Unfortunately, there's only 4 programs like mine in the country, and we're the only one out in the West. I get about 5 to 10 students a year, and we serve them until they graduate. Currently, we have 38 students. About 85% of them depend on IHSS for their personal care needs while they're in college. But we work with our Workability 4 program, which is also funded by Department of Rehabilitation, like my program, to prepare them for employment, and World Institute on Disability to prepare them for making good financial choices and understanding how to kind of snake through the financial system to maintain your services so that you can make that leap once you graduate and get a really great job with a great UC Berkeley diploma to make enough money to where you don't need to have social services anymore and you can pay back into the tax base. And I wish there was more programs like that around the country, but our ability to function is going to be really severely impacted. Just an example, normally at this point of the year, my students have all gotten IHSS and are mostly staffed by their own caregivers. This year, none of my students who've applied for IHSS have gotten it so far. It's just ground to the halt.
Now, I'm sorry to interrupt, but did you say you were funded by Department of Rehab, or are you part of the is the university involved at all in funding the
We're
services?
departed with some funding from the university, but mostly from the Department of Rehab.
Okay.
It's kind of a cooperative contract. But I'm supposed to say I'm speaking on my own behalf today, not on behalf of UC.
But you're informing us very well about the program, so we appreciate that.
So we see kind of the writing on the wall, and we're trying to prepare for the future of what to do to allow this to still exist. And one thing we're looking into is a thing called microboards, which people are forming in, started in Canada. They have them in Tennessee and Texas. We're actually worried that the Lanterman Act might mess with our ability to do that. But it's basically forming a small nonprofit corporation around an individual, and you become a Medicaid waiver provider, and that's how. I mean, it's going to be really complicated. It's a lot of work, and there's also like a 3-month gap between losing your IHSS and getting that, where you got to raise a lot of money, but you have total control. So that's one thing we're looking into, and I'm working with some people to create like a cooperative housing for disabled people and attendants kind of living together in Berkeley. So,
Well, keep us informed about all that. I'm very interested in all of those alternative models. They sound innovative and creative, and we need to look at every possible way that we can help folks survive this storm.
Yeah.
So if there's action by the state agencies involved or legislative requirement, I hope you'll keep us informed.
I'd be glad to. Thank you for letting me speak, and it's really once again great that you're forming this committee, and I hope it's able to influence some of the other legislators.
Well, glad to have you, and thank you for your contribution to today's discussion. So, yes.
Thank you. Good to see you again. I want to say Senator, but Assemblymember Chesborough. My name is Michael O'Grady, and I work with North Bay Regional Center, and I'm a case management specialist who works in a very specific area of CPP deflection. I used to say my job is to keep clients out of the developmental centers at all cost. I can't say that latter part anymore. The budget cuts are interfering with my ability to keep clients out of the developmental centers. I also work with our clients who find themselves involved in our judicial system, and often I'm designing reports on competency training and all of that. And again, Porterville is usually the place we tend to send them, and I would prefer not to do that. It tends to be a very dangerous place. However, with CPP deflection, and it's my understanding, it's based on a physical plant, such as a bedroom in a group home or a facility where 50% of it's allocated to CPP deflection, and that it does not follow the individual. Yet we're coming up with very challenging individuals, many of those who have come out of the DC system already, who have broken the law and sometimes quite severely and stuff. And I can't claim deflection on them. I may have to put them in locked facilities, since it's California Psychiatric Transition for competency training, College Hospital in Southern California, very expensive facility. But my understanding is if I could do CPP deflection, wouldn't we get 55% of that back from the feds or something, which is exactly what we need in this state. So I guess I would like to ask, and again, I don't know all involved here, but I'd like to see CPP deflection based on the individual who's at risk for going to a developmental center, not on something we assigned a year or 2 years ago as a bedroom in a group home. Many of these clients with these severe behavioral challenges come out of the DCs. They can't go into these group homes with other behavioral challenged individuals, because when you get the run-of-the-mill inappropriate behaviors, this clientele takes it to the nth degree. The law's broken, the police are out, crisis facilities have shut down now, we can't send them there, and I'm ending up with the jail system with everyone yelling at me they don't belong there. I agree. So help me, please.
Raised some very challenging issues, but hopefully, besides myself and the committee staff, the director continues to sit in the audience and listen, and hopefully we can incorporate some of your suggestions and concerns. Thank you.
Thank you for forming this committee.
Sure. Sure.
Hi, I'm Richard Greenwood. I'm a union steward from North Bay Regional Center, and I want to thank you for convening this committee. I think this is wonderful, and I remember your work from some years ago in the Senate, and if you'll recall that we worked together, I did with your staffer at that time, Peggy Collins, on developing caseload standards that we actually were able to change the Lanterman Act and establish some standards that were really needed at the time because we were under the gun from the federal government, who had basically put California on probation because of the poor quality of services in the community. And as part of that audit at that time, they were suspended our ability to add people to the waiver program until we fixed these problems. And one of the problems was caseloads being outrageously high in the 90s for service coordinators. I forgot to mention that I'm a service coordinator. And that's something that that legislation was really key at that time to getting us to the point where we were able to add people back to the waiver. And it's still out there. We're still holding out that we're going to try to keep the 1:62 caseload ratios for service coordinators so they can actually go out, check on people, and make sure that they're not being abused and that their wheelchair, aren't being rolled into whatever, and making sure that the services are adequate and so forth. With the budget cut last year, the 3% cut, that was unallocated to operations for regional centers, at that same time, those standards were all completely lifted. And so regional centers have also not been required to report, because part of that legislation was to report. So they lifted that as well.
So that was repealed in budget language. Is that what happened?
It's part of the sunset. It sunsets this year. The proposal is it's going to sunset again in 2011. And of course, we would like that 3% restored to regional centers, both in POS, because there were rate cuts to programs as well that were just across the board rate cuts to programs that are already financially strapped. You can't expect that these programs are going to provide quality services when they're cut like that. They're not going to be able to hire staff that are trained, that are going to be able to treat the consumers the way they need to be treated. And so at some point, I hope that it is sunsetted, it doesn't become a permanent thing, and that we work to get that back, both in operations and POS. However, at this time, the union is asking, and we're proposing that in this new extension, that the transparency part of it be restored, that regional centers still be required to report the caseloads, what they are. We need to be able to see what they are. And the other piece of this is that there was sunshine language that was also there that was stricken, which should be restored, and that has to do with reporting on operations expenditures, salaries, and so forth, which was presented at that time a year ago as being some sort of budget savings. It wasn't. There's no budget savings there. There's no reason why that can't be restored, and we need to monitor, because what's happening is when they lifted the standards, some of the regional centers are doing well in terms of trying to hire staff, but some are going wild with these caseloads. We're talking over 100. Now, how can a service coordinator do a good job with 100 cases? The department's not monitoring it because they're not getting the data. And so I'm hoping that, and I'm sure that you will support us in trying to get the transparency restored at the very least, and we will. We are proposing that in the trailer bill.
Seems like a rather modest request under the circumstances, and
thank you,
considering the population that you serve. So thank you, Mr. Stern, I presume.
Yeah, you got me.
Okay, this is our last speaker.
Last speaker.
Last but not least.
Richard's pretty much taken the wind out of my sails. This is all I spent the last hour writing this, what he said. But the transparency is important. There's no cost savings in not reporting the caseloads by category that we've had for the last 10 years since you worked on this and pushed it through legislation. It gives everyone a handle on what's really happening. And I want to add that what's really needed actually is to add maximums. What we have now is a system, or had, which wasn't adequate, was a system of reporting averages. So there was an average that was required. And that average could be kept, but some people on a case could have caseloads still up in the 90s and above. At my regional center, I know one person in EI who's bilingual, who's in the 90s right now by the nature of being bilingual. But EI, early intervention, should never be anywhere above, 50s or 60s. These things happen. If we reported the maximums, then regional centers would be able to be held accountable for keeping some balance. It's a check and balance sort of situation. The workers need that, and it really, it impacts hiring and retention, and it impacts the quality overall of case management, of the services we provide to our consumers. And I'm sure you've heard lots of parents talk about how bad it is when your case managers are constantly cycling. It's terrible for those families, and it's directly linked to caseload numbers. And I think the reporting would really help.
Okay.
And it costs nothing to report. They track it all the time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And let me just close by thanking everyone who's here and those who had to go ahead and depart. It's been a great re-immersion for me, even though it's painfully difficult times for everybody. But I think, I wouldn't be in this business if I wasn't an optimist. So I think we can get through it and rebuild and try to do the best we can to try to make sure that the current population, particularly population of young people, aren't asked to bear an unfair share of the burden for the fact that they happen to be coming into the system at a time when we're spread so thin, And this is a passion of mine, and I'll commit to you to do what I can under the great constraints and circumstances we're under. So thank you all